If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. The ancient Douglas firs of Olympic National Forest stretch toward heaven like cathedral pillars, their massive trunks disappearing into shadows 300 feet above. Robert Thorne completed his evening rounds with the methodical precision of a man who had learned to find peace in routine. At 35, his stocky frame moved with quiet authority through the wilderness, graying black hair catching the last amber light filtering through the canopy. The Pacific Ocean's distant roar, mixed with the soft calls of spotted owls, nature's evening symphony playing just for him. This was why he'd traded his DEA badge for a ranger's uniform, to protect something pure instead of fighting humanity's endless corruption. 8 years tracking cocaine smugglers through South American jungles had taught him that humans were capable of unimaginable cruelty. He'd watched his partner Miguel get skinned alive by cartel enforcers while he hid helpless in the jungle, too far away to help, too close to forget. Robert's green eyes, sharp from years of surveillance work, scanned the forest with professional awareness. The knife scars on his forearms, souvenirs from a cartel safehouse raid, caught on his sleeve as he adjusted his radio. The cremated remains of his partner rested in a small vial in his pack, waiting for the right moment to be scattered in. This pristine wilderness, where Miguel's spirit might finally find peace, but tonight felt different. The wildlife had gone unnaturally quiet, as if the forest itself held its breath. Even the insects had stopped their eternal chorus. Robert's DEA training kicked in. When nature goes silent, predators are near. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, pregnant with the kind of Pacific Northwest storm that could trap a man for days. His 1986 radio equipment, state-of-the-art for the time, would be useless once the storm hit. The nearest town lay 40 miles of winding mountain roads away, and his backup wouldn't check on him for 3 days. He was truly alone. The wind shifted, carrying scents that didn't belong in this ecosystem, metallic blood and sulfur. Robert's nostrils flared as atmospheric pressure from the approaching storm pressed down like a physical weight. His breath came harder, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cooling evening air. A massive shadow passed overhead through the canopy, too large and too silent to be any bird he knew. Robert froze, hand instinctively moving to his service weapon. Whatever had just passed over was big enough to block out significant portions of the fading daylight, and it moved with purpose rather than the random patterns of wildlife. He stood, motionless, for 5 full minutes, listening with the patience that had kept him alive in Colombian jungles. Nothing. But that itself was wrong. The forest should never be this quiet. Even in the depths of winter, there should be something moving, breathing, living. Robert keyed his radio, hoping to reach the ranger station. Static answered him, punctuated by sounds that made his skin crawl, high-pitched screeching that didn't belong in any earthly throat. He tried again, adjusting frequencies, but the sounds only grew louder, more insistent. As he clicked off the radio, the first drops of what looked like rain began falling through the canopy. Robert held out his hand to catch some, then jerked it back in revulsion. The liquid was warm, thick, and unmistakably red. Blood was raining from the forest canopy 300 feet above. The blood fell steadily now, pattering against leaves, with wet sounds that reminded Robert of crime scenes he'd rather forget. He pulled out his flashlight, its beam revealing crimson streams running down the massive tree trunks, like tears from wooden giants. Whatever was bleeding up there was big, and it was bleeding a lot. Following the blood trail led him to scattered debris that made his stomach clench. Pieces of a small aircraft were strewn across several acres, but not in the pattern of a crash. The metal was torn, twisted, shredded as if by enormous claws rather than impact. Most disturbing was what wasn't there. No engine, no large pieces, no bodies. Just fragments scattered like confetti after a celebration of violence. Robert knelt beside a piece of fuselage, his trained eye taking in details. The metal edges weren't burned or melted from impact, but ripped, showing tremendous force applied from above. Claw marks scored the aluminum in parallel grooves, each one easily 2 inches wide and deep enough to penetrate the aircraft's skin like paper. His flashlight beam began behaving strangely, bending and refracting in ways that violated physics. Shadows moved independently of their sources, writhing like living things across the forest floor. When he aimed the light directly at them, they seemed to absorb the illumination, creating pools of darkness deeper than the surrounding night. The sulfur stench grew stronger, concentrated around trees whose bark had been stripped away in long, parallel gouges. Robert measured 1 claw mark against his own body. It started 15 feet above ground and extended down to eye level. Whatever made these marks was either enormous or could fly while maintaining enough leverage to gouge old-growth Douglas. Fur. His compass spun wildly when he approached certain trees, the needle rotating without settling on any direction. His watch had stopped completely, its second hand frozen, as if time itself had become distorted in this place. The very air felt thick, resistant, like moving through invisible cobwebs. Emergency gear hung from treetops like macabre decorations. Backpacks, sleeping bags, hiking boots, all showing the same claw damage as the aircraft. But no bodies, no bones, nothing to indicate what had happened to their owners. The gear swayed gently in the sulfur-scented breeze, empty and accusatory. Robert's throat closed as he recognized a child's bright yellow rain jacket among the suspended belongings. The fabric was shredded, but not blood-stained, as if whatever had torn it apart had been careful not to damage what lay inside. The implication made him physically ill. Electronic interference increased as he moved deeper into the affected area. His radio now produced only the inhuman screeching, occasionally modulating into sounds that almost resembled words in languages he didn't recognize. The static seemed to respond to his movements, growing louder when he approached certain trees and softer when he backed away. Cold spots appeared without warning, dropping the temperature 20 degrees in perfect circles around specific trees. Robert's breath misted in these areas despite the warm October evening, and frost began forming on his equipment. The boundaries were sharp and precise, as if invisible refrigeration units were perfectly placed throughout the forest. His DEA instincts screamed danger signals he'd learned to trust in life-or-death situations. Something was watching him with the patient intelligence of a human predator, but the feeling was wrong somehow. The presence felt too big, too alien, too focused in ways that suggested an intelligence beyond human understanding. As he backed away from a particularly large claw-marked tree, Robert heard it for the first time, a sound like leather wings beating against air, but massive, coming from directly above. The blood rain increased, and something large moved through the canopy with deliberate stealth, tracking his every movement. He was no longer alone in the forest, and whatever shared this space with him had been hunting here long before he arrived. The creature dropped from the canopy with the silence of death itself. 12 feet of wingspan unfurled above Robert as a nightmarish fusion of bat and humanoid landed on a branch 30 feet away. Leathery wings stretched between elongated finger bones, while its torso maintained disturbingly human proportions, covered in dark fur that shifted color to match the shadows. But it was the eyes that paralyzed him. Glowing red orbs that seemed to look directly into his mind, past his defenses, into memories he'd buried beneath years of alcohol and guilt. Robert felt his consciousness being invaded, probed, violated in ways more intimate than physical touch. Images flooded his mind unbidden, Miguel's face contorting in agony as cartel enforcers peeled away his skin strip by strip. The creature was inside his head, feeding on his trauma, growing stronger from his pain. Robert's hands shook as the memories played with crystal clarity, every detail enhanced beyond what he actually remembered. The Bat-Squatch's intelligence was immediately apparent. It used a broken branch as a tool, testing Robert's reactions by tapping it against tree trunks in different rhythms. When Robert moved left, it threw rocks to herd him right. When he tried to retreat, it positioned itself to cut off escape routes. With mathematical precision, ultrasonic sounds beyond human hearing made Robert's inner ear feel like it was being stirred with knives. Vertigo struck without warning, sending him stumbling into trees while the creature watched with what could only be described as amusement. The disorientation came in waves, perfectly timed to disrupt any attempt at coordinated movement. Worse than the physical effects were the hallucinations. Miguel appeared beside him, still being tortured, still dying, still begging Robert to save him. The creature was weaponizing his greatest failure, turning his own guilt into a weapon more effective than claws or fangs. "You left me," Miguel's phantom whispered. "You watched them kill me and did nothing." Robert's rational mind knew it was a projection, but his traumatized psyche responded as if Miguel were really there. Tears streamed down his face as he raised his service weapon with shaking hands, knowing bullets might not stop something that could invade minds. The Bat-Squatch's skin rippled and changed, matching bark patterns so perfectly that it seemed to disappear and reappear like a living optical illusion. Only its eyes remained constant, red beacons that tracked his every movement with predatory focus. Then he heard the others. Answering calls echoed from multiple directions, similar creatures communicating in frequencies that made his teeth ache. Robert realized he wasn't facing a single predator, but a coordinated pack using sophisticated hunting strategies. They were surrounding him, cutting off escape routes, communicating his position to each other with military precision. The Alpha, the one directly above him, began emitting sounds that weren't quite ultrasonic. Robert's mind translated them against his will, understanding somehow that this was language. Complex, alien, but undeniably intelligent communication. They weren't just animals, they were people. Different people, angry people whose territory he'd invaded. "You killed our children," the voice in his head accused, though the creature's mouth never moved. "The flying metal nest carried our young to their deaths." The scattered aircraft debris took on new meaning. This wasn't random destruction, but retaliation. The pack had destroyed the plane because it had somehow threatened their offspring. Robert was being judged for crimes he didn't even know he'd committed. Miguel's phantom grew more solid, more accusatory. "You always choose the wrong side, Roberto. You served corruption for years, and now you're here to destroy innocence again." The creature above him moved with supernatural speed, appearing in multiple locations almost simultaneously. Robert's eyes couldn't track the movement. One moment it was on his left, the next on his right, then directly overhead again. Physics seemed negotiable to these beings. As understanding dawned, Robert's horror deepened. He wasn't facing mindless monsters, but an intelligent species defending their young from human encroachment. And his presence here, his very existence as a representative of the civilization that had already destroyed so much, marked him as a threat that had to be eliminated. The forest around him had become a courtroom, and he'd already been found guilty. The nesting area revealed itself as Robert was herded deeper into the forest by the coordinated pack. Ancient Douglas firs stretched their highest branches into a natural cathedral where dozens of silk-wrapped cocoons hung like grotesque fruit. Each cocoon was human-sized, and some still moved with faint, rhythmic pulsing. Robert's stomach lurched as he realized what he was seeing. The missing hikers, the aircraft passengers, they weren't dead. They were being preserved, possibly as food sources or incubators for the creature's offspring. The organic webbing that wrapped them pulsed with alien life, keeping the victims alive but unconscious, suspended between life and death. The alpha bat squatch descended to a lower branch, close enough that Robert could smell its musk. Earthy and metallic, like soil mixed with iron. Its red eyes fixed on him with an intelligence that was disturbingly familiar. It wasn't just studying him, it was reading him, understanding his tactics, his training, his weaknesses. DEA agent Robert Thorne, a voice spoke directly into his mind. You hunt the plant sellers, but here you are the poison. The creature knew him, had somehow accessed not just his memories, but his identity, his history, his purpose. The revelation that these beings could extract such specific information from human minds made Robert's blood run cold. How long had they been studying humans? How much did they know about civilization's plans for this forest? Miguel's phantom solidified beside him, no longer just a projection, but seemingly real enough to touch. You see, Roberto, you brought death to paradise, just like Colombia, just like everywhere you go. The psychological assault intensified as more pack members emerged from the shadows. 5 creatures now surrounded him, each one adding its psychic pressure to the mental invasion. Robert felt his sense of self beginning to fragment under the combined attack, his identity scattered across multiple alien consciousnesses. His training took over, despite the mental chaos. DEA survival protocols kicked in, when outnumbered by intelligent opposition, changed the terrain to your advantage. Robert's eyes tracked upward to the nesting tree, its massive trunk offering vertical escape if he could reach it. But the creatures anticipated his strategy. As soon as he moved toward the tree, they repositioned to cut off his approach. Their coordination was flawless, like a military unit that had trained together for decades. Every movement was countered, every tactic anticipated. You cannot escape. What you are, Miguel's voice echoed in his skull. A killer, a destroyer. Everything you touch turns to ash. The guilt was overwhelming, but beneath it Robert felt something else stirring, the cold determination that had kept him alive in cartel strongholds. These creatures might be intelligent, might even be defending their young, but they had human beings hanging in cocoons above his head. Whatever moral ambiguity existed in this situation, those people were dying while he debated ethics. One of the cocoons twitched more violently than the others, and Robert heard a muffled scream from inside. Someone was awake in there, aware of their situation, begging silently for rescue. The sound shattered his paralysis and ignited the protective instincts that had driven him to become a ranger. The Alpha sensed his emotional shift and responded by intensifying the memory assault. Robert relived Miguel's death in excruciating detail, every cut, every scream, every moment of helpless watching. But this time, instead of paralysis, the memories fed his rage. You want to see a killer, Robert whispered, drawing his service weapon. I'll show you what 8 years of cartel warfare taught me. He aimed not at the Alpha, but at the base of the nesting tree, where several support branches converged. If he could weaken the structure, the entire nesting area might collapse, giving the cocooned victims a chance at survival even if it killed him in the process. The creatures realized his intent instantly. The Alpha's scream of rage was both audible and psychic, a sound that felt like knives scraping against his skull. The pack moved as one, launching themselves at him with supernatural speed and coordination. Robert had one chance to reach the tree and climb above their reach, one chance to turn this ancient forest into a battlefield, where his military training might overcome their supernatural advantages. He ran toward the trunk as 5 alien predators dove toward him through air thick with sulfur and blood. Robert's hands found purchase on the rough bark as claws raked across his back. shredding his ranger uniform and opening deep gashes that immediately began bleeding. The ancient Douglas fir's bark was thick enough to provide handholds, but climbing one-handed while holding his weapon meant every foot gained was paid for in blood and effort. The alpha bat squatch pursued him vertically, its powerful wing arms allowing it to ascend faster than any human should be able to climb. At 50 feet up, Robert felt the creature's breath on his neck, hot, sulphurous, reeking of decay and alien biology. He spun on the trunk and fired 3-shot center mass, the muzzle flash illuminating the creature's 2 human eyes. The bullets struck but didn't penetrate. Instead, they seemed to be absorbed by the creature's hide, as if its biology could adapt to kinetic threats in real time. The alpha's response was a psychic scream that made Robert's nose bleed and nearly caused him to lose his grip. At 100 feet, the cocoons hung within arm's reach. Robert could hear muffled breathing from inside several of them, confirming his worst fears. Living people were suspended here, kept alive for purposes he didn't want to contemplate. One cocoon was small enough to belong to the child whose rain jacket he'd found below. Miguel appeared beside him on the trunk, as solid as the bark beneath Robert's hands. "Look what your presence has caused, Roberto. These people die because you brought war to their sanctuary." The hallucination was so perfect that Robert could smell his dead partner's cologne, see the scar above his left eyebrow from a training accident years ago. But Miguel's eyes held no warmth, only accusation and disappointment. "I tried to save them," Robert gasped, continuing his climb as the alpha circled him like an aerial shark. "Did you? Or did you just make everything worse, like always?" At 150 feet, Robert reached for his emergency flares. If these creatures feared nothing else, they might fear fire. The ancient tree was dry enough to burn, despite the blood rain, and a fire this high up would spread through the canopy faster than anything could escape. The first flare ignited with a brilliant red glare that caused all 5 creatures to shriek in unison. The alpha recoiled, as if physically burned by the light itself. Robert wedged the flare into a crack in the bark and immediately lit a second one, then a third. The dry wood caught instantly. Flames raced up the trunk and out along branches with frightening speed, turning the 300-foot tree into a massive torch. The cocoons began to smolder, and Robert heard screams from inside, the victims waking up as their prisons burned. Around them, "Now you've killed them all," Miguel said sadly. "The very people you meant to save." The alpha, driven to fury by the threat to its nesting site, attacked through the flames. Its hide blistered and cracked from the heat, but it pressed forward anyway, claws extended to tear Robert apart. The creature's devotion to protecting its young was absolute, even unto death. Robert met the attack with his final 2 flares, jamming them directly into the creature's eyes. The alpha's death scream was both audible and psychic, a sound that linked Robert's consciousness to every victim the creature had ever killed. He experienced dozens of deaths simultaneously: hikers, campers, aircraft passengers, all of them dying in terror and confusion. But as the alpha died, its final psychic projection showed Robert the truth. The creatures weren't monsters, they were refugees, the last of their kind, driven from their original habitat by human development, trying desperately to survive in the few wilderness areas remaining. The aircraft had been carrying surveyors, planning to clear-cut this section of forest for development. The creatures weren't the invaders. Humans were. The burning tree began to fall as its base weakened from the intense heat. Robert's victory had become a catastrophe that would consume thousands of acres of irreplaceable old-growth forest. As he fell with the tree, surrounded by flames and smoke, he realized he had become exactly what Miguel's hallucination had accused him of being, a destroyer who turned everything he touched to ash. The forest fire would burn for weeks, erasing centuries of growth in days. And Robert would die knowing he had committed genocide against an intelligent species that had only been trying to protect its children from human expansion. As consciousness faded, he thought he saw Miguel one last time, shaking his head in disappointed recognition of what his partner had become. Robert struck the ground with the sound of breaking bones, his body twisted at angles that spoke of massive internal damage. Third-degree burns covered 60% of his skin, where flaming debris had struck him during the fall. But he was still alive, still conscious enough to witness what his actions had wrought. The fire had spread beyond the nesting tree into the surrounding canopy, jumping from crown to crown with supernatural hunger. Ancient Douglas firs that had stood for centuries became towers of flame, their death screams lost in the roar of combustion. Wildlife fled in panic, deer, bears, countless smaller creatures, all of them innocent victims of his decision to bring war to their sanctuary. Through eyes swollen with burns and trauma, Robert watched the cocoons fall like burning meteors. Some split open on impact, revealing the withered but still living forms of the missing hikers. A few might survive their ordeal, but they would carry scars from both their captivity and his rescue that would never heal. The child's cocoon landed near enough for Robert to see inside. The little girl was alive but unconscious, her breathing shallow and labored. She would live, but only because the creatures had kept her in perfect preservation. They hadn't been torturing their captives. They had been protecting them, keeping them safe from some threat Robert had never understood. Miguel's phantom sat beside him, no longer accusatory, but infinitely sad. "You see now, don't you, Roberto? They weren't the monsters." As if in response to his realization, Robert felt the vial of Miguel's ashes in his pack crack from the heat. The cremated remains of his partner began leaking out, mixing with the ash and smoke rising from the burning forest. Miguel's spirit, if such things existed, was joining the smoke of hundreds of innocent creatures dying because of Robert's inability to see past his own trauma. The truth crystallized in his failing consciousness. The Batsquatch pack hadn't been randomly attacking humans. They had been defending their territory from a surveying expedition that would have destroyed their last refuge. The aircraft had been full of developers and environmental assessors, not innocent passengers. The creatures had acted to protect both their young and the forest itself from exploitation. And Robert, in his traumatized paranoia, had responded to their protection with annihilation. "I was trying to do the right thing," he whispered through burned lips. "The road to hell," Miguel replied gently, "is paved with good intentions and self-righteous fury." The fire spread beyond Robert's line of sight, consuming wildlife corridors that connected this forest to the Pacific coastline. Salmon runs would be disrupted, bird migration patterns altered, entire ecosystems destroyed. The environmental damage would cascade for decades, all because he had chosen to fight instead of trying to understand. In his final moments, Robert experienced one last psychic communication from the dying Alpha. Not words, but pure emotion, forgiveness, mixed with profound sadness. The creature understood that Robert had acted from trauma and ignorance rather than malice. Even dying, it felt pity for the human who had destroyed himself trying to save others. The last thing Robert saw was a search and rescue helicopter silhouetted against the burning sky, come to investigate the massive forest fire. They would find him, and the surviving cocoon victims would create a report about a ranger who had somehow started a catastrophic wildfire while fighting unknown attackers. But they would never understand the truth, that the Pacific Northwest's last cryptid species had died trying to save the forest from human development, and that their protector had killed them out of misguided heroism. Robert Thorne died as ash from his partner's remains fell on his face like grey snow, carrying with it the judgment of two men who had spent their lives fighting the wrong enemies. Forest fire burned for 17 days, consuming 47,000 acres of old-growth wilderness. Official reports blamed a lightning strike during the October storm, never mentioning the ranger whose charred body was found at the base of a massive Douglas fir, or the strange cocoons discovered nearby containing victims of what authorities assumed was a cult kidnapping ring. The Olympic National Forest was permanently altered, its ancient cathedral spaces replaced by acres of blackened stumps and ash. And somewhere in that ash, the last evidence of an intelligent species that had tried to coexist with humans until humans decided coexistence was impossible. The blood moon rose that night over a forest that would never again shelter the creatures that had called it home for thousands of years. In the end, Robert Thorne had succeeded in his mission to protect the wilderness. He had made it so desolate that no one, human or otherwise, would ever want to inhabit it again. The silence in Glacier National Park was absolute, the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums like a physical weight. Michael Ironwood's breath crystallized in the brutal February air as he guided his snowmobile along the Going to the Sun road, the engine's rumble echoing off the towering peaks that surrounded him like ancient sentinels. Fresh powder snow stretched endlessly in every direction, unmarked except for his own tracks cutting through the pristine wilderness. At 43, Michael had spent enough winters in these mountains to know when something felt wrong. This morning, as the peaks glowed pink in the dawn light, that wrongness sat in his chest like a chunk of ice. The park had been officially closed to visitors for 2 months now, leaving him alone on 1,583 square miles of the most beautiful and unforgiving wilderness in North America. The nearest human contact was 50 miles away in Kalispell, and with the massive storm system building beyond the Continental Divide, even that lifeline would soon be cut. Michael's weathered hands, marked with frostbite scars from high altitude, missions in places the Army preferred not to name, gripped the handlebars as he navigated around a drift that had formed overnight. 12 years as a Green Beret medic had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct he possessed was screaming that he shouldn't be alone out here. Not today. The thermometer on his dashboard read -30 degrees Fahrenheit and, falling 10 degrees colder than the Weather Service had predicted, that was the first concrete sign that something was amiss. In 8 years as a park ranger, Michael had learned to read these mountains like a favorite book, and this chapter was written in a language he didn't recognize. He brought the snowmobile to a stop near Hidden Lake Overlook and killed the engine. The silence that followed was so complete, it seemed to have physical presence, broken only by the distant crack of glacial ice shifting under its own immense weight. Michael climbed off the machine and checked his radio, already knowing what he'd find. The display showed nothing but static. The mountain terrain created dead zones, even in the best conditions. And his 1982 equipment had limitations that would make a difference between life and death up here. What disturbed him most was the absence. In all his years patrolling these mountains, Michael had never seen them so devoid of wildlife. No mountain, goats picking their way across impossible cliff faces, no elk tracks in the powder, no sign of the black bears that should be denning somewhere in the lower elevations. It was as if every living thing with sense had fled, leaving only him and whatever was coming with the storm. Michael's military training had left him emotionally detached from most things, a necessary armor after losing his wife Sarah and 6-year-old daughter Emma in a highway accident while he was deployed to a place that didn't officially exist. The guilt of not being there, of surviving when they hadn't, had driven him to seek the most isolated and dangerous postings he could find. These mountains offered the perfect combination of beauty and lethality, a place where a man could lose himself in the vastness, or find the heroic death that might balance the cosmic scales. But even his emotional numbness couldn't completely shield him from the wrongness that permeated the air like ozone before a lightning strike. The wind patterns were shifting randomly, carrying sounds that echoed off the peaks in impossible ways. Twice, he could have sworn he heard music, a low, mournful tune that seemed to rise from the glacial ice itself. He pulled out his field glasses and scanned the surrounding peaks, looking for anything that might explain the growing unease in his gut. The black clouds, building beyond the continental divide, were moving faster than any natural weather system should, and they carried a darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than merely blocking it. The approaching storm would bring snow measured in feet rather than inches, and if he was caught on the high country when it hit, even his military-grade cold weather gear and 2 weeks of emergency supplies might not be enough. Michael had come to these mountains seeking isolation, perhaps even seeking death on his own terms. But as he stood in the supernatural stillness of that February morning, watching impossible ice formations catch the early light like frozen lightning, he began to understand that he might have found something far worse than either solitude or a clean death in the wilderness. The wind shifted again, carrying with it a sound that made his blood freeze in his veins, a deep, rhythmic rumbling that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. It was the sound of something massive breathing, something that had been asleep for a very long time and was now beginning to wake. Michael's radio crackled to life as he descended toward the loop road. But instead of the familiar voice of dispatch, static filled with what sounded like whispers in languages he didn't recognize poured from the speaker. He quickly switched it off, the silence that followed somehow more ominous than the strange transmissions. The first concrete sign of wrongness appeared 3 miles down the trail, a group of ice formations that definitely hadn't been there during his patrol 2 days ago. They rose from the snow like twisted spires, geometric patterns that looked artificially created but showed no tool marks. The ice was perfectly clear, almost crystalline, and when the morning sun hit them at the right angle, they threw rainbows across the snow that seemed to move independently of the light source. Michael stopped the snowmobile and approached one of the formations, pulling off his glove to touch the surface. The ice was so cold it burned his fingertip, and for a moment he could have sworn he saw something moving deep within the crystalline structure, a shadow that shouldn't exist in solid ice. That's when he found the first body. The hiker was perfectly preserved, frozen solid in a sitting position with his back against one of the ice spires. His face was turned upward, mouth open in what might have been a scream or a prayer, and his eyes were covered with a thin film of ice that made them look like clouded marbles. The man's permits, still visible in the plastic sleeve attached to his pack, showed he'd been reported missing in October, 4 months ago. But it was the arrangement that made Michael's training kick into high alert. This wasn't a random death from exposure. The body had been positioned deliberately, and as he looked around with tactical eyes, he could see others. 5 hikers in total, all from different time periods based on their gear and permits, all arranged in a perfect circle around the largest ice formation. Their arms were positioned to point inward, towards something at the center of the spire that Michael couldn't quite make out through the distorting ice. Michael activated his emergency beacon and tried the radio again, but the whispers were stronger now, almost drowning out his own voice as he attempted to report the discovery. The transmission cut out after 3 words, leaving him alone with the dead and the growing certainty that whatever had killed them was still here. His military-grade equipment began malfunctioning as he documented the scene. The camera's LCD screen showed static instead of images, and the batteries in his GPS unit drained completely in the space of 5 minutes, despite being fully charged that morning. The metal components of his gear were becoming so cold they felt like they might shatter, and when he tried to take temperature readings near the ice formations, his thermometer stopped at -60 degrees and refused to go lower. That's when he noticed the blood ice. Scattered throughout the area were smaller formations that glowed red in the morning light. At first, Michael thought it might be some kind of mineral deposit or algae bloom, but as he got closer, the metallic scent was unmistakable. The formations were made of frozen human blood mixed with something else, something that gave the ice an oily, iridescent quality that made his eyes water to look at directly. The tracks appeared as he was photographing the blood ice formations. With an old Polaroid camera he'd grabbed as backup, footprints in the snow that measured 3 feet long, with 6 distinct toe marks, pressed deep into ground that had been frozen solid for months. Whatever had made them was impossibly heavy, and the prints led away from the circle of bodies toward the higher elevations where the glacial ice met the sky. Michael followed the tracks for 200 yards before they simply stopped, ending at the edge of a crevasse that descended into darkness. He shone his flashlight into the depths, but the beam seemed to be swallowed by the ice itself, revealing nothing except a faint blue glow that pulsed with the same rhythm as the whispers on his radio. The aurora appeared that afternoon, despite being several hundred miles too far south for the northern lights. The sky filled with unnatural colors, deep purples and greens that pulsed in time with something that sounded like a massive heartbeat. The lights cast shifting shadows across the snow that moved independently of their source, and Michael caught glimpses of shapes in those shadows that looked almost human, but stretched and distorted in ways that hurt to contemplate. As the temperature continued to drop in localized zones that defied all meteorological logic, Michael realized he was dealing with something far beyond his experience as either a soldier or a ranger. The evidence pointed to something that shouldn't exist, something that was actively hunting in his mountains and had been doing so for longer than any human records could account for. The sound of splintering wood drew his attention to a grove of ancient pines near the trail. Embedded in the massive trunks were crude weapons made of ice, spears and clubs that had been thrown with enough force to penetrate solid wood to a depth of 3 feet. The ice was the same unnatural blue as the glow in the crevasse, and it showed no signs of melting despite the thermite heat pack he held against one of the spear points. As the black clouds finally reached the peaks above him and the first flakes of what would become a legendary blizzard began to fall, Michael made a decision that would define his final hours. Instead of retreating to the safety of the lower elevations, he followed the giant tracks toward their source, driven by a combination of military duty and the death wish that had brought him to these mountains in the first place. The blizzard hit with supernatural fury as Michael climbed toward the source of the tracks, each gust of wind carrying ice crystals that cut like glass and temperatures that made his breath freeze before it left his lungs. His snowmobile had died 2 miles back, its engine seizing as the oil turned to sludge in the impossible cold, leaving him to continue on snowshoes through drifts that reached his chest. The tracks led him higher than any human should venture. In such conditions, up past the tree line to where the glacial ice met the living rock of the Continental Divide. Here the wind screamed between the peaks with a voice that sounded almost intelligent, almost angry, and the aurora overhead had intensified to the point where it cast more light than the hidden sun. Michael's medical training told him he was already in the early stages of hypothermia. His fingers were numb, despite his thermal gloves, and his thoughts were becoming sluggish and disconnected. But his combat instincts, honed by years of fighting in hostile environments, kept him alert to the growing sense that he was being watched. The glacial crevasse appeared ahead of him like a wound in the ice, 50 feet wide and extending down, into darkness that seemed to have depth beyond measurement. The tracks led directly to its edge, and then, impossibly, continued down the vertical ice wall, as if whatever had made them could walk on surfaces no human could navigate. Michael secured his climbing rope to an ice anchor and rappelled into the crevasse, his headlamp beam swallowed by the supernatural darkness below. The walls were smooth as glass, but carved into them were symbols that predated any human writing system, spirals and geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when he wasn't looking directly at them. 50 feet down, the crevasse opened into a vast ice cave, and Michael's light revealed something that challenged every assumption he'd ever made about the natural world. The chamber was filled with structures made of living ice, not carved or molded, but grown like coral from the walls and floor. They pulsed with the same blue light he'd seen above, and within their translucent depths he could see the preserved forms of animals and humans from across centuries. At the center of the chamber stood the source of the tracks. The frost giant was 15 feet of living ice and ancient stone, its body a fusion of glacial ice and bedrock that spoke of ages when the world was younger and colder. Blue flames burned in empty eye sockets, and when it moved, the sound was like icebergs calving into Arctic seas. It turned toward Michael with the slow inevitability of a geological epoch, and when it spoke, its voice carried the memories of everyone who had ever died in the ice. "You should not have come here, little flame." The words came from everywhere and nowhere, spoken in the voices of the dead hikers above and others whose bones lay scattered beneath millennia of snowfall. This realm belongs to winter. Michael's military training kicked in automatically, his hand moving to the sidearm that would be useless against something made of elemental ice. But even as logic told him he was facing certain death, his tactical mind was cataloging details that might keep him alive for a few more minutes. The creature moved slowly, its massive bulk requiring time to shift direction. The ice formations around the chamber created natural cover, and his thermite grenades might create enough heat to at least inconvenience something made of frozen water. "I'm Michael Ironwood, United States Park Service," he said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded in the supernatural cold. "I'm responsible for the safety of everyone who enters this park." The giant's laugh was the sound of avalanches beginning, a rumble that shook ice from the chamber ceiling. "Responsible. You soft creatures are responsible for the warming that weakens my realm, for the machines that spew heat into the sacred cold. I am merely reclaiming what was always mine." As the creature spoke, images flooded Michael's mind. Visions of the world as it had been during the Ice Ages, when glaciers covered most of North America and creatures like this one ruled vast frozen empires. He saw the slow retreat of the ice over millennia, the gradual warming that had driven the frost giants into hiding in the deepest glacial crevasses, waiting for the cold to return. "The warming will not stop," Michael said, understanding beginning to dawn. "The world is changing, and creatures like you will be forgotten." The giant finished, its blue flames flaring brighter. "Unless we remind the warm bloods what true winter means, unless we show them that some things should remain frozen." The attack came without warning. The creature raised one massive arm, and the air around Michael crystallized instantly, ice forming on his clothes and gear with supernatural speed. He rolled behind one of the natural ice formations as spears of frozen air shot toward him, each one capable of pinning him to the chamber wall like an insect in amber. Michael pulled a thermite grenade from his belt and activated it, the sudden flare of heat creating a pocket of survivable temperature around him. The giant recoiled from the heat source, giving him time to understand the true scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just a creature defending its territory. It was a weapon of climate warfare, a living embodiment of winter that could extend its influence far beyond this single mountain. The radio on his belt crackled to life, picking up his own voice from some impossible transmission. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Ranger Ironwood. Something is coming down from the glaciers, something that can control the weather itself. If you're receiving this, evacuate the entire region and prepare for a winter that won't end. But the voice wasn't coming from his radio. It was coming from the giant, speaking in Michael's own words from a future that hadn't happened yet. The creature was showing him what would come to pass if he failed here, in this frozen chamber beneath the world. "Choose, little flame," the giant said, advancing through the steam from his thermite grenade. "Join the eternal cold willingly, or be added to my collection by force. Either way, your warm world dies with the coming of the endless winter." Michael's training took over as the frost giant advanced through the dissipating heat of his thermite grenade. 12 years of Special Forces operations had taught him that. In impossible situations, you didn't fight the enemy's strengths. You found their weaknesses and exploited them with everything you had. The creature was massive and nearly indestructible, but it was also bound by the laws of physics, even supernatural physics. Ice was strong but brittle under the right conditions, and Michael had enough demolitions training to turn that knowledge into a weapon. He pulled back deeper into the ice chamber, using the natural formations as cover, while the giant's freezing attacks turned the air around him into a crystalline death trap. His second thermite grenade bought him enough time to reach his pack and extract the real weapons, military-grade plastic explosives that he'd been carrying for avalanche control work. "You cannot hurt winter itself," the giant rumbled, its voice now coming from multiple directions as it used the ice formations to amplify and redirect sound. "I am as eternal as the cold between the stars." Michael didn't waste breath on a response. He was placing charges with the practiced efficiency of a demolitions expert, using shaped charges to focus the explosive force where it would do the most damage to the chamber's structural integrity. The giant might be immune to conventional weapons, but it was still standing in a cavern held up by natural ice formations that could be brought down with the right application of controlled force. As he worked, the creature began its psychological assault, manipulating the ice around him to create perfect frozen images of Sarah and Emma, his wife and daughter. The figures moved and spoke with supernatural life, calling to him to join them in the eternal cold where families could be together forever. "We've been waiting for you, Michael." Sarah's voice echoed through the chamber, and when he looked up from placing the charges, she was there, exactly as she'd been on the day he left for his final deployment. "We've been so cold without you." Emma stood beside her mother, 6 years old and perfect, her small hand reaching out toward him. "Daddy, why didn't you come home? Why did you let us die alone?" Michael's hands trembled as he set the final charge, the psychological attack hitting him harder than any physical assault the giant could mount. The guilt he'd carried for 8 years threatened to overwhelm his tactical thinking, but his military training held firm. This was exactly the kind of mental warfare he'd been taught to resist, use the enemy's psychological weapons against them. "You're not my family," he said, his voice steady despite the tears freezing on his cheeks. "My family would never ask me to let innocent people die." The illusions shattered like breaking glass, and the giant's roar of frustration shook the entire chamber. Michael triggered the first set of charges, and the explosion echoed through the ice like thunder, sending massive chunks of frozen stone crashing down around them. The creature wasn't significantly damaged, but the chamber's structural integrity was compromised. Cracks appeared in the ceiling, and Michael could hear the ominous sound of the glacier above, beginning to shift under its own weight. "If you destroy this place, you destroy yourself as well," the giant said, its blue flames dimming as it realized what Michael was planning. "Is your desire for death so strong that you would take an ancient being with you?" Michael pulled the pin from his final thermite grenade and held it against the master detonation control for his remaining explosives. The heat would set off a chain reaction that would bring down not just the chamber, but a significant portion of the glacier above them. It would be suicide, but it would also bury the frost giant under millions of tons of ice and rock. "I've been looking for a good death for 8 years, Michael said, thinking of Sarah and Emma and all the people who would visit these mountains in the springs to come. This one will do. But before he could trigger the final explosion, the giant played its last card. The ice around them began to reshape itself, forming a perfect replica of the ranger station where Michael had spent so many lonely nights. Sarah and Emma appeared again, but this time they were warm and alive, reaching out to him with love instead of accusation. "Don't leave us again, Michael," Sarah whispered. "We can be a family here, forever." The cold preserves everything, keeps everything exactly as it should be. For a moment, Michael's resolve wavered. The offer was everything he'd wanted since that terrible phone call 8 years ago. A chance to undo the worst mistake of his life, to be the husband and father he should have been. All he had to do was let go of the detonator and accept the eternal winter that would keep his family safe forever. But then he heard it. A sound from the world above that cut through the supernatural cold like a blade of warm steel. Somewhere, on the mountainside, a helicopter was fighting through the blizzard, probably searching for him. There were people up there, risking their lives to save his, and they would become the giant's next victims if he failed here. "I love you," he said to the illusions of his wife and daughter, and meant every word. "But you're not real, and the people above are. I won't let them die for my guilt." Michael triggered the thermite grenade and dove away from the master detonator as the chamber filled with superheated steam. The giant's scream of rage was lost in the sound of explosions as the shaped charges detonated in sequence, each one precisely placed to maximize structural damage to the ice formation supporting the chamber. The explosion that followed was heard, as far away as Kalispell, a sound like the mountain itself splitting apart. Michael felt the glacier above him collapse in a cascade of destruction that made the earth shake like a living thing in pain. The frost giant's final roar was lost in the thunder of millions of tons of ice and stone falling into the crevasse, burying both of them in an avalanche of Michael's own making. In the moments before the debris reached him, suspended in time, between detonation and destruction, Michael felt a strange peace settle over him. He'd found the heroic death he'd been seeking, but more importantly, he'd found purpose in that death. The people who would come to these mountains in the springs ahead would be safe, at least for now. The radio on his belt crackled to life one final time, picking up his emergency beacon's automated transmission. "This is Park Ranger Michael Ironwood. GPS coordinates follow. There is something in the glacial ice, something that can control weather systems and temperature on a massive scale. Climate change is going to free things that should stay buried. This is my final transmission. Tell them what they're going to face." The message would be dismissed by authorities as hypothermia-induced delirium, filed away with a dozen other strange reports from rangers who'd spent too much time alone in hostile environments. But a few scientists studying the unusual seismic activity in Glacier National Park that February would note the temperature anomalies and the strange atmospheric disturbances that preceded the avalanche. Michael died from hypothermia while, pinned beneath the ice, his body temperature dropping too far below sustainable levels for his medical training to save him. But even as the cold claimed him, he could feel something else trapped in the frozen darkness beside him. The frost giant, equally pinned, equally buried, but not destroyed. The creature's blue flames still burned somewhere in the glacial tomb. They now shared, and Michael understood with the clarity that comes at the moment of death that this was not an ending, but a postponement. The warming world above would eventually reach even these depths, and when it did, both Guardian and Monster would wake from their icy sleep. But that was a problem for future generations, for people who would hopefully be better prepared for the things that climate change would release from the world's frozen places. Michael had bought them time, bought them warning, bought them the chance to face the ancient terrors with knowledge instead of ignorance. The search and rescue helicopter found the avalanche site 3 days later after the blizzard finally passed. The debris field covered 12 acres, and extended down into the deepest parts of the glacier, making recovery impossible with 1982 technology. Michael Ironwood was declared dead in the line of duty, another ranger who'd given his life to the mountains he'd sworn to protect. But the other searchers noted unusual readings on their instruments, temperature fluctuations that didn't match the weather conditions, electromagnetic anomalies that interfered with their radio communications, and ice formations in the debris field that seemed to grow visibly while they watched. The official report listed the cause of the avalanche as natural glacial movement, exacerbated by recent temperature changes, but one investigator included a note about the ranger's final radio transmission and the strange environmental readings they'd encountered. That report found its way to a small group of scientists who were beginning to study the relationship between climate change and geological stability. Decades later, as global warming accelerated and glaciers around the world began their final retreat, those same scientists would remember the warnings from a dead ranger in Montana and realize that the Earth had been trying to tell them something important about the things that lived in the ice. In the depths of the glacier, two forms remained locked in eternal combat: a park ranger who'd found redemption in sacrifice, and an ancient creature waiting for the world to grow cold enough to wake. Between them lay the answer to questions humanity wasn't yet ready to ask about the price of progress and the things that had been sleeping in the frozen places of the world. The ice above them grew thinner each year, and sometimes, on the coldest nights in February, hikers reported hearing sounds from deep within the glacier, the echo of explosions from long ago, or perhaps the sound of something massive stirring in its sleep, counting the years until the ice grew thin enough to crack. Michael Ironwood had won his battle and lost his life, but the war between the warming world and the ancient cold would continue long after his name was forgotten. In saving the people of his generation, he had passed the responsibility to those who would come after, trusting them to be ready when the ice finally gave up its secrets. The mountains kept their vigil, and in the depths of the glacier, so did he. The first light of dawn painted Death Valley in shades of copper and gold, revealing an alien landscape that belonged more to Mars than Earth. Elizabeth Stone adjusted her wide-brimmed hat and checked her watch. 5:47 a.m., and already the thermometer, clipped to her gear belt, read 85 degrees Civ. By noon, it would climb past 125 degrees Civ, temperatures that could kill a person in hours. She stood beside her dusty Jeep at the edge of the Badwater Basin, the lowest point in North America, where ancient salt flats stretched toward distant mountains like a frozen white sea. The silence was so complete it seemed to press against her eardrums, broken only by the occasional crack of thermal expansion as rocks prepared for another day of brutal heat. Elizabeth had been a park ranger for 5 years now, ever since she'd fled the aircraft hangars of the Pacific Theater. The war had ended, but she carried its ghosts, particularly one ghost, Lieutenant James Morrison, her fiancé, whose P-51 Mustang had exploded over the Philippine Sea because she'd missed a hairline crack in the fuel line during her pre-flight inspection. 30 seconds of overlooked metal fatigue had cost her everything. "Focus, Stone," she muttered to herself, using the same voice she'd perfected when barking orders to subordinates who questioned a woman's right to work on fighter planes. Monthly patrol, check the emergency caches, monitor the rescue beacons, standard procedure. But nothing about this place felt standard. Death Valley was a geological wound in the Earth's surface, a place where the planet's violent past remained, visible in twisted rock formations and mineral deposits that painted the mountains in impossible colors. Ancient lakebeds told stories of climate catastrophes that had turned paradise into hell, and everywhere she looked, the landscape seemed to whisper warnings about hubris and survival. Elizabeth climbed back into her Jeep, its engine turning, over with a reliable purr that gave her a moment's comfort. She'd maintained this vehicle herself, just as she'd maintained dozens of aircraft engines during the war. Mechanical things made sense. They followed rules. Unlike the human heart, they could be fixed when they broke. The Jeep's radio crackled to life as she adjusted the frequency. "Base, this is Ranger Stone beginning remote sector patrol. ETA for first cache check is 0800 hours. Static answered her, which wasn't unusual in this terrain. The mountains played hell with radio signals, and the nearest ranger station was 80 miles away across some of the most forbidding wilderness in North America. She was truly alone out here, which was exactly how she preferred it. Elizabeth engaged the four-wheel drive and began her descent into the valley proper. The track, it couldn't really be called a road, was little more than tire ruts carved by previous patrols, winding between formations of rocks that looked like sleeping giants. Her mission would take her to 6 emergency water caches scattered across the most remote sections of the monument, checking their integrity and replacing any supplies that had been damaged by the extreme conditions. As she drove, she mentally reviewed the route. Cache 1 lay 12 miles southeast, hidden in a box canyon that provided shade during the worst heat. Cache 2 was another 8 miles beyond that, near an old mining claim where foolish prospectors had once sought their fortunes and found only death. The others were spaced at strategic intervals, a lifeline network for anyone unlucky enough to be caught in this wasteland without adequate preparation. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the heat's first real assault. Even with the Jeep's windows down and the morning breeze flowing through the cab, Elizabeth could feel sweat beginning to collect beneath her uniform. She reached for her canteen, the first of 4 she carried, and allowed herself a careful sip. Water discipline was critical out here. Every drop was precious. Something glinted ahead in the morning light, catching her attention. Elizabeth slowed the Jeep and squinted through the windshield. There, carved into a section of solid sandstone, were elaborate spiral patterns that definitely hadn't been there during her last patrol. The formations were too precise, too artistic, to be natural erosion. Yet who could have created them out here, in the middle of nowhere with no tools? She stopped the Jeep and climbed out for a closer look, her boots crunching on the mixture of sand and salt that covered everything in Death Valley. The patterns were beautiful in their complexity, interlocking spirals and geometric designs that seemed to pulse and shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. The work must have taken hours, maybe days to complete. But that was impossible. No one came out here except rangers, and she would have seen any other vehicle tracks. The formations were fresh, the sand still loose around their edges. As she bent closer to examine the craftsmanship, a chill ran down her spine, despite the rising heat. The patterns weren't carved into the rock. They were carved into the sand itself, which had somehow been fused into shapes that held their form. Despite the wind that constantly reshaped this landscape, no human tool could accomplish such precision, and no natural process could create such artistic complexity. Elizabeth straightened, her hand instinctively moving to the pistol on her hip. Something was very wrong here, but she couldn't identify exactly what. The rationale part of her mind, the part trained in aircraft maintenance and systematic problem-solving, suggested wind erosion or perhaps some quirk of flash flooding she'd never encountered before. The deeper part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive through Pacific storms and enemy fire, screamed warnings she didn't want to hear. She climbed back into the Jeep, but before starting the engine, she made a note in her logbook. Mile 7.2. Unusual sand formations observed. Origin unknown. Recommend geological survey. Professional. Documentation was important, even when, especially when, you couldn't explain what you were documenting. The engine turned over on the first try, and Elizabeth felt some of her tension ease. Machinery was reliable, Machinery made sense. Whatever had created those formations, her job remained the same. Complete the patrol, check the caches, maintain the safety network that might someday save a life. She pressed the accelerator and continued deeper into Death Valley, unaware that behind her, the spiral patterns in the sand began to shift and change, reforming into new configurations that spelled out words in a language far older than human speech. Cache 1 should have been a routine stop. Elizabeth had checked this emergency supply station dozens of times over the past 5 years, and the procedure never varied. Verify the water container's integrity, check the first aid supplies, test the emergency beacon, document everything in her log. But when she opened the reinforced metal box hidden in the shade of the canyon wall, the smell hit her immediately. Sulfur and corroded metal, sharp and acrid in the dry air. The water containers, which should have held 40 gallons of pure, life-saving liquid, reeked like rotten eggs. Even through their sealed caps, the contamination was obvious. Elizabeth unscrewed one of the caps and immediately jerked back. The water had turned a sickly yellow-green color, and metallic flakes floated on its surface like diseased snow. Every container showed the same contamination, despite being sealed systems that should have been impossible to breach. "What the hell?" she muttered, pulling out her logbook. This wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. These caches were inspected monthly, and the water had been crystal clear just 4 weeks ago. No chemical process she knew could cause this level of contamination in sealed containers, especially not in the middle of a desert where there were no industrial pollutants for hundreds of miles. She checked the emergency. Beacon next. Dead. The device that should have been broadcasting a steady signal to help lost travelers find the cache showed no signs of life, despite the battery indicator reading full charge. Elizabeth tried the backup battery, then checked. The connections with the expertise of someone who'd kept complex electronics running under combat conditions. Everything looked perfect, but the beacon remained silent. The first aid supplies fared no better. Bandages had yellowed and become brittle. Medications had crystallized in their containers, and even the metal tools showed signs of rapid corrosion. It was as if decades of decay had been compressed into a few weeks. Elizabeth documented everything meticulously, but her hands were shaking slightly as she wrote. Professional training demanded she consider logical explanations. Chemical contamination from nearby mining operations, equipment failure, extreme temperature fluctuations. But her gut told her something else was happening here, something that didn't follow the rules she'd built her life around. The Jeep's engine coughed when she turned the key. Not the smooth purr she'd come to expect, but a rough, uncertain sound that made her frown. She popped the hood and spent 20 minutes checking every component she could reach. The cooling system showed signs of stress, despite the relatively mild morning temperature, and several metal parts displayed surface corrosion that shouldn't have been possible in the dry desert air. "Come on, girl," she whispered to the engine, using the same tone she'd once used to coax life from battle-damaged aircraft. "Don't give up on me now." The engine caught on the third try, settling into an uneven idle that set her teeth on edge. Elizabeth had enough mechanical experience to know when a machine was trying to tell her something, and right now her Jeep was screaming warnings she didn't want to hear. The drive to Cache 2 took longer than expected. Her compass began giving inconsistent readings, the needle swinging wildly between magnetic north and directions that made no sense given the sun's position. Landmarks she'd memorized, over 5. Years of patrols appeared in the wrong places. A distinctive rock formation that should have been on her left loomed to the right, and a dry creek bed she'd expected to cross seemed to have vanished entirely. Elizabeth stopped 3 times to check her position, each time growing more confused. Either her equipment was failing catastrophically, or the landscape itself was changing in ways that violated every natural law she understood. The radio offered no help. Static filled every frequency, occasionally interrupted by sounds that might have been voices speaking in languages she didn't recognize. Once she could have sworn she heard someone screaming in the distance, but when she stopped the engine to listen, only silence greeted her. Cache 2, when she finally located it, was even worse than the first. The metal storage box had been partially buried under a sand dune that definitely hadn't existed during her last patrol. More disturbing, the sand wasn't randomly deposited by wind. It formed precise geometric patterns around the cache, spirals and angles that echoed the formations she'd seen earlier. Inside the box, the water had turned black, not just contaminated, but utterly opaque like liquid tar. The smell was indescribable, rot and sulfur and something else, something organic and wrong. Elizabeth didn't even attempt to open these containers. Whatever had happened to them was beyond anything in her experience, but it was the footprints that made her blood run cold. Leading away from the cache, pressed deep into the sand, were tracks unlike anything she'd ever seen. They were roughly human-shaped, but far too large. Each print nearly 2 feet long, with deep gouges where claws or talons had scored the earth. The tracks led directly toward a section of solid rock face, where they simply stopped, as if whatever had made them had walked directly into the stone and vanished. Elizabeth drew her sidearm, a .38 revolver that had never failed to provide comfort in uncertain situations. But holding it now, standing in the growing heat beside those impossible tracks, she felt more vulnerable than she had since her first night under Japanese artillery fire. The sun was climbing toward its zenith, and the temperature was beginning its murderous ascent toward the day's peak. Professional protocol demanded she continue the patrol, check the remaining caches, complete her mission. Personal survival instinct screamed at her to turn around immediately and race back to civilization. She compromised by trying the radio, again hoping to reach base station and report the contamination. But instead of static, the radio now produced something that made her skin crawl, a low, rhythmic sound like breathing, punctuated by whispers in that same unknown language. Elizabeth switched off the radio and stared out at the vast emptiness of Death Valley. The landscape that had always seemed harsh but honest now felt actively malevolent, as if the desert itself had developed a consciousness and found her presence offensive. For the first time since coming to this job, she wondered if she was in over her head. But Elizabeth Stone had never backed down from a challenge, even when common sense suggested retreat. Her fiancé had died because she'd missed a crucial detail, failed to catch a problem before it became fatal. She wouldn't make that mistake again. She climbed back into the Jeep, noting with growing alarm that the engine temperature was already climbing despite the morning hour. Whatever was happening out here, it was affecting everything: water, metal, electronics, even the fundamental properties of the landscape itself. The third cache lay 20 miles deeper into the valley, across terrain that would become a furnace. Within hours, Elizabeth checked her remaining water supplies, calculated travel time and heat exposure, and made her decision. She would continue the patrol. She would complete her mission. And she would document everything, no matter how impossible it seemed. Behind her, invisible in the shimmering heat, something vast began to stir beneath the sand, responding to the vibrations of her departing Jeep like a predator sensing prey. The third emergency cache was gone. Elizabeth stared at the empty space where 40 gallons of water and critical supplies should have been hidden, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing, not destroyed, not buried, gone. The GPS coordinates were exact. The landmark rock formations matched her photographs, but the cache itself had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. More disturbing were the changes in the landscape around the missing cache. The ground showed signs of upheaval, as if something massive had moved beneath the surface. Cracks radiated outward from the cache location in a pattern too regular to be natural, forming concentric circles that reminded her uncomfortably of the sand formations she'd been seeing all morning. Elizabeth knelt beside one of the larger cracks and peered into its depths. The fissure disappeared into absolute darkness, and when she dropped a pebble into it, she never heard it hit bottom. A warm breeze emerged from the crack, carrying scents of sulfur and something else, something organic and ancient that made her stomach turn. The Jeep's engine was running rough now, coughing and sputtering despite her constant attention. The cooling system was working overtime, steam beginning to rise from the radiator, even though the outside temperature had only reached 110 degrees. At this rate, she'd be stranded in the middle of Death Valley during the peak heat of the day, a death sentence for anyone without adequate shelter and water. But it was the sound that finally shattered her professional composure. It started as a low rumble, felt more than heard, like distant thunder from a storm that would never come to this arid wasteland. But as Elizabeth listened, the rumble resolved into something that made her skin crawl. Breathing. Massive rhythmic inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from the earth itself. The desert was breathing. She backed away from the cracks, one hand on her pistol, the other fumbling for her radio. When she switched it on, the breathing sound emerged from the speaker as well, synchronized with what she heard around her. Whatever was making that sound was large enough to affect radio frequencies across the entire valley. "Base station, this is Ranger Stone," she spoke into the microphone, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I have an emergency situation. Request immediate assistance." The breathing stopped. For a moment, the desert fell into a silence so complete that Elizabeth could hear her own heartbeat. Then from the radio speaker came a voice she recognized with shock that nearly stopped her heart. Liz, is that you?" It was James, her dead fiancé's voice, clear and unmistakable, coming through. The radio from impossible distance and time. "James," she whispered, knowing it couldn't be real, but unable to stop herself from responding. "I've been waiting for you, Liz. Waiting so long. You know it's your fault I'm dead, don't you? You missed the crack in the fuel line. Your mistake killed me." Elizabeth's hand shook as she gripped the radio. "You're not real. James is dead. He died 3 years ago. Because of you," the voice continued, taking on the slightly mechanical tone of radio transmission while remaining heartbreakingly familiar. "You were supposed to be the best. You were supposed to catch everything, but you failed, and now I'm here, waiting in the dark, waiting for you to join me." She switched off the radio, but James's voice continued, now coming from the cracks in the earth around her, multiple voices all speaking in perfect unison. "You can't run from what you did, Liz. You can't escape the truth." Elizabeth stumbled. Back to the Jeep, her breath coming in short gasps. Hallucinations, heat exhaustion, equipment malfunction. There had to be a rational explanation for what she was experiencing. The alternative, that something supernatural was using her guilt against her, was unthinkable. But when she looked at her hands, they were steady. Her pulse was elevated, but not dangerously so. She showed none of the classic signs of heat exhaustion or dehydration. Whatever was happening to her, it wasn't medical. The Jeep started on the first try, but the engine note had changed again. What had been a rough idle now sounded almost organic, like a sick animal struggling for breath. Steam poured from the radiator in earnest now, and the temperature gauge was climbing into the red zone. Elizabeth had perhaps an hour before mechanical failure stranded her completely. The smart move, the safe move, would be to turn around immediately and race back toward the park boundary, hoping to reach help before the engine died completely. Instead, she pressed the accelerator and continued deeper into Death Valley. She couldn't explain why. Professional duty demanded she complete the cache inspections, but that alone wouldn't have been enough to override survival instinct. Something else was drawing her forward, a compulsion she didn't understand but couldn't resist. The landscape around her was changing in ways that hurt to observe directly. Sand dunes shifted position even as she watched, reconfiguring themselves into patterns that seemed meaningful but remained just beyond comprehension. Rock formations twisted into impossible shapes, geological processes that should have taken millennia compressed into moments. And everywhere, carved into sand and stone, were those spiral patterns. They covered every surface now, growing more complex and urgent, as if trying to communicate something vital. Elizabeth found herself slowing to study them, her mind struggling to decode their meaning, even as her rational thoughts screamed that she was wasting precious time. The patterns seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, synchronized with the breathing sound that continued to emerge from the earth. And as she stared at them, Elizabeth began to see faces in the spirals, dozens of human faces, all twisted in expressions of terror and despair. One of them was James. She floored the accelerator, the jeep lurching forward across the increasingly unstable terrain. But even as she tried to escape the carved faces, she could feel something vast stirring beneath the desert floor, following her progress with malevolent intelligence. The fourth cache location appeared ahead, marked by a distinctive formation of red rock that stood like a monument in the endless wasteland. But as Elizabeth approached, she realized the rocks were moving, not with the slow shift of geological time, but with purposeful, predatory motion. The formation was reshaping itself, creating what looked like a massive arena with her jeep at its center. Walls of stone rose from the sand, blocking her escape routes one by one until only a single narrow gap remained. Elizabeth gunned the engine toward that gap, but it snapped shut just as she reached it, trapping her in a circle of rock walls that towered 50 feet overhead. The jeep's engine chose that moment to finally give up, dying with a mechanical death rattle that echoed off the stone walls. She was trapped in the heart of Death Valley, with no water, no transportation, and temperatures that would kill her in hours. But as she sat in the sudden silence, listening to the desert breathe around her, Elizabeth realized that heat exposure was the least of her problems. Something was moving in the sand at the center of the arena. Something large was rising from the depths, and it had been waiting a very long time to meet her. The thing that emerged from the sand defied every natural law Elizabeth had ever learned. It rose like a dust devil at first, a spinning column of particles that caught the brutal afternoon light and scattered it in prismatic patterns. But as it gained height and mass, the sand began to coalesce into something that resembled a human form while remaining utterly alien. It stood 15 feet tall when fully formed, its body a constantly shifting mass of desert sand held together by forces Elizabeth couldn't comprehend. Where a face should have been, she saw only a swirling vortex of particles that occasionally suggested features. Eyes like black holes, a mouth that opened onto infinite depth. When it moved, parts of its form scattered on the wind, only to reform elsewhere, as if the creature existed in multiple states simultaneously. "Welcome, Elizabeth Stone," it spoke, and its voice was the sound of wind through ancient canyons, of sand grinding against stone for millennia. "I have been waiting for you." Elizabeth's hand moved instinctively to her pistol, but she knew bullets would be useless against something that wasn't entirely solid. "What are you?" she managed to ask, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "I am the guardian of this place," the entity replied, its form shifting as it spoke. Sand fell from its body like tears, only to spiral back up and rejoin the mass. "I am what remains when civilizations die and the desert reclaims their bones. You call me demon, but I am merely the accumulated will of the earth itself." The creature moved closer, and Elizabeth felt the temperature around her fluctuate wildly. One moment the air was cold enough to frost her breath, the next it was hot enough to sear her lungs. The sand demon wasn't just manipulating its own form, it was rewriting the basic properties of reality within its domain. For 1,000 years, I've watched your kind pour into my sacred spaces, it continued, gesturing at the rock walls surrounding them. Always taking, always consuming, never understanding that some places are meant to remain untouched. This valley is a monument to patience, to the slow work of stone and wind. Your machines and roads and emergency caches are an infection. Elizabeth, backed against the jeep, trying to keep distance between herself and the creature. I'm trying to protect people. The caches save lives. Lives that should not be here, the demon hissed, and suddenly the air filled with images, mirages that showed Death Valley's past and future. She saw ancient peoples who had lived in harmony with the desert, taking only what they needed and leaving no permanent scars. Then she saw the miners, the developers, the tourists who treated the valley as a playground for their conquest of nature. You seek to make safe what should remain dangerous, the creature continued. You encourage intrusion with your safety nets and emergency beacons. Every life you save brings 10 more who think they can conquer the unconquerable. The images shifted, and Elizabeth saw herself through the demon's perception, not as a protector, but as an enabler of environmental destruction. Every cache she maintained, every lost hiker she'd helped rescue, every safety improvement she'd implemented was seen as a betrayal of the desert's essential wildness. "But you interest me, Elizabeth Stone," the creature said, its voice taking on an almost conversational tone. "You carry such exquisite guilt, such perfect self-hatred. You know you failed your lover, failed in your duty, yet you continue to play protector. Why?" The question hit her like a physical blow. Elizabeth had spent 3 years avoiding that exact introspection, burying her guilt under professional competence and isolation. But here, trapped in this supernatural arena with nowhere to run, she couldn't escape the truth. "Because I have to," she said finally. "If I don't protect people, who will?" "Ah," the demon smiled, an expression that looked terrifying on its shifting features. "But you didn't protect James Morrison, did you? You inspected his aircraft, pronounced it airworthy, and sent him to his death. Your expertise, your judgment, your careful attention to detail, all worthless when it mattered most." Elizabeth's breath caught as the creature began to change shape again, the sand reforming into a familiar silhouette. Within moments, James stood before her, perfect in every detail, except for the sand that constantly fell from his form, like a body slowly disintegrating. "Hello, Liz," he said in James's exact voice. "I've missed you." "You're not him," Elizabeth whispered, but her heart was pounding with the desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, this might be real. "Aren't I?" the false James asked, approaching with movements that perfectly mimicked her dead fiancé's characteristic stride. "I feel like him. I remember our last conversation when you promised you'd keep me safe. I remember the sound my plane made when the fuel line ruptured, the explosion you could have prevented if you'd been better at your job." Elizabeth closed her eyes, trying to block out the vision. "James forgave me. He told me it wasn't my fault. James told you what you needed to hear because he loved you," the creature replied, its voice shifting between James's tones and the demon's inhuman timbre. "But love doesn't change facts. Your negligence killed him. Your failure to notice a hairline fracture in a fuel line, a mistake so basic that any competent mechanic should have caught it. The accusation was nothing she hadn't told herself 1,000 times, but hearing it in James's voice made the guilt fresh and devastating. Elizabeth opened her eyes to find the sand. James standing just inches away, his face wearing an expression of profound disappointment. "You could join me," he said softly. "Stop running from what you did. Let the desert reclaim you. Let the guilt finally end. I'm so tired of waiting alone." For a moment, Elizabeth almost considered it. The weight of 3 years' guilt pressed down on her, and the thought of finally laying down that burden was almost overwhelmingly tempting. Death in the desert would be quick enough once the sun reached its peak. She could stop fighting, stop pretending she deserved to live when James was dead because of her mistake. But then she remembered something else. The real James's words during their last conversation. Not the guilt-laden final moments before his fatal flight, but something he'd said months earlier when she'd questioned her ability to handle the pressure of wartime maintenance work. "Liz," he'd said, "everyone makes mistakes. The difference between a good mechanic and a great one isn't perfection. It's what you do after you screw up. Do you learn and get better, or do you give up?" Elizabeth looked at the false James, seeing now how the creature had crafted its psychological attack. It was using her guilt, her self-doubt, her tendency toward isolation against her. But James, the real James, would never have wanted her to give up. He would have wanted her to learn from her mistake and keep protecting others. "You're right," she said to the sand demon, straightening her shoulders. "I did make a mistake. James died because I missed something I should have caught. But that doesn't mean I should stop trying to save lives." The false James snarled, his face contorting into something inhuman. "You can't escape your guilt so easily." "I'm not trying to escape it," Elizabeth replied, pulling out her pistol. "I'm trying to live with it. There's a difference." She fired 6 shots directly into the creature's center mass. The bullets passed harmlessly through its sandy form, but the act of defiance seemed to surprise it. For a moment, its shape wavered and became less solid. "Bullets cannot harm me," the demon said, reforming its humanoid appearance. "I know," Elizabeth replied, already reloading, "but iron can disrupt your coherence, and I've got more than bullets." She was thinking of her jeep, several 100 pounds of steel and iron that the creature had overlooked in its psychological assault. If she could figure out how to weaponize it, she might have a chance. The sand demon must have read her intentions, because the rock walls around them began to close in, preparing to crush both her and her vehicle. But Elizabeth Stone had spent years maintaining complex machinery under impossible conditions. If there was a way to turn her mechanical skills into weapons, she would find it. The real battle was just beginning. Elizabeth dove for the jeep as the rock walls began grinding inward, their movement accompanied by a sound like the earth itself, screaming. She had maybe 60 seconds before the arena collapsed completely, crushing her and eliminating any chance of escape. But 60 seconds was enough time for a plan if you thought fast and acted faster. The jeep's engine was dead, but the electrical system still had power. Elizabeth yanked open the hood and began rapidly disconnecting components, her hands moving with the muscle memory of 1,000 emergency repairs under combat conditions. She pulled the radiator hoses loose, letting the remaining coolant spray across the sand, and was rewarded by the sand demon's howl of pain. "Water," she breathed, understanding flooding through her. "You're weakened by moisture." The creature staggered back as the coolant soaked into the sand around its feet, its form becoming less stable where the liquid touched it. Elizabeth grabbed her largest canteen and began dousing the ground around the jeep, creating a protective circle of wet sand. "Clever," the demon hissed, its voice distorted as parts of its body lost coherence. "But you have perhaps 3 gallons of water total. I have an entire desert." It was right, but Elizabeth wasn't thinking about long-term strategy anymore. She was thinking about the jeep's electrical system, about the battery that still held a charge, and about what happened when electricity met moisture. She stripped the insulation from the battery cables with her teeth, working with desperate speed as the rock walls continued closing in. The arena was now barely 20 feet across, and the sound of grinding stone filled the air with choking dust. The sand demon seemed to realize what she was planning, because it surged forward despite the water-soaked ground, its form wavering, but still dangerous. Elizabeth connected the bare wires to her canteen and threw the improvised electrical weapon directly into the creature's core. The result was spectacular. The battery discharged in a brilliant flash, and the sand demon convulsed as electricity coursed through its water-dampened form. For a moment, its sandy body became rigid, held in place by electromagnetic forces it couldn't control. But the victory was temporary. The battery was drained, the creature was already beginning to recover, and the rock walls were now close enough that Elizabeth could touch both sides simultaneously. That's when she noticed the fuel tank. The jeep carried 20 gallons of gasoline, and Elizabeth had used explosive fuel-air mixtures before to clear debris from aircraft hangars. If she could figure out how to weaponize that fuel in the confined space of the collapsing arena, she used her service knife to puncture the fuel tank, letting gasoline pour out across the sand. The fumes were overwhelming in the confined space, and she had to fight the urge to vomit as vapors filled her lungs. But she kept working, soaking everything, the jeep, the sand, even her own clothes, with flammable liquid. "You would destroy yourself to harm me?" the sand demon asked, its voice showing the first hint of uncertainty she'd heard. "If necessary," Elizabeth replied, pulling out her Zippo lighter. It was a gift from James, carried through the entire war and every day since. She'd never expected to use it as a weapon. "But I'm betting you're more flammable than I am." The creature hesitated, and in that moment of uncertainty, Elizabeth saw her chance. But she also saw something else, a flicker in the demon's form that revealed its true nature. This wasn't just an ancient guardian spirit. It was composed of the accumulated remains of everyone who had ever died in Death Valley, their final moments of terror and despair compressed into this malevolent entity. Among the swirling faces in the sand, she recognized prospectors who had died seeking gold, tourists who had underestimated the desert's dangers, and dozens of others who had become part of the creature's essence. The sand demon wasn't just protecting the desert, it was feeding on human suffering, growing stronger with each death. "You're not a guardian," Elizabeth said, the lighter's flame dancing in her hand. "You're a parasite. You don't protect this place. You make it more dangerous to attract victims." The demon's form wavered, caught between attack and retreat. The desert must be respected through fear. Only those who understand its lethal beauty deserve to survive. Elizabeth laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Fear doesn't create respect. It creates panic, and panic kills people. You're not some noble protector. You're just a serial killer with delusions of grandeur." The walls were now close enough to scrape her shoulders, but Elizabeth stood her ground. She'd spent 3 years believing her guilt made her unworthy of protecting others. Now she understood that guilt could be transformed into determination. James hadn't died so she could hide in the desert feeling sorry for herself. He'd died so she could learn to be better. "I won't let you hurt anyone else," she said, and flicked the lighter. The explosion was everything she'd hoped for, and more. Confined in the narrow space between closing rock walls, the fuel-air mixture created a blast that shattered stone and sent the sand demon's form scattering across hundreds of yards. Elizabeth felt the heat sear her lungs and the concussion knock her senseless, but she also felt the creature's agonized scream as fire disrupted its molecular bonds. When she regained consciousness, she was lying in a crater where the arena had been. The rock walls had been blown apart, leaving only rubble and fused sand. Her clothes were singed, her hair was burned short, and she could taste blood where the explosion had cut her mouth. But she was alive. The sand demon was not. Or rather, it was dying. Its scattered particles were trying to reform, but the fire had damaged something fundamental in its structure. Where once it had been a unified entity, now it was merely loose sand, animated by failing will. This is not possible. it whispered, its voice barely audible as individual grains lost their connection to the collective consciousness. Elizabeth struggled to her feet, surveying the destruction. Her jeep was completely destroyed, the emergency supplies scattered, and she was stranded in Death Valley during the peak heat of the day with no water and no means of communication. By any logical measure, she had won the battle but lost the war, but then she noticed something miraculous. Where the creature's essence had fallen, the sand was changing color. Not the sickly yellows and greens of contamination, but the pure white of clean minerals. The water from the destroyed emergency caches was bubbling up from underground springs, clear and fresh. The sand demon's death was purifying the very ground it had corrupted. More importantly, she could hear engines in the distance, multiple vehicles approaching fast. Her prolonged absence and the explosion had apparently been noticed after all, as rescue vehicles crested the ridge and began descending toward the crater. Elizabeth looked down at the dying remains of the sand demon. Individual particles were blowing away on the desert wind, no longer held together by malevolent will. "The desert doesn't need a monster to protect it," she said to the dissipating entity. "It just needs people who understand that some places demand respect." The last conscious grains of sand formed words in the dirt at her feet. Then, protect them. And with that, the sand demon faded into ordinary desert. Its reign of terror finally ended. The rescue team found Elizabeth Stone standing in the center of a perfectly circular crater, surrounded by wreckage that made no sense according to any natural explanation. The official report would list the incident as a flash flood event with possible seismic activity, because no one wanted to document what she actually told them about sand demons and supernatural guardians. But Elizabeth didn't care about official explanations anymore. She had work to do. The purification effect that followed the sand demon's destruction spread throughout Death Valley over the following weeks. Contaminated water caches mysteriously returned to pristine condition. Emergency beacons that had failed began working again, and the impossible sand formations smoothed back into natural patterns. More importantly, the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the valley's remote sections lifted like fog before sunrise. Elizabeth requested reassignment to Death Valley's Emergency Response Coordination, a new position that let her overhaul the entire safety system. She established better communication protocols, improved cache maintenance procedures, and created educational programs that taught visitors to respect the desert's dangers without being paralyzed by fear. She never spoke publicly about what had really happened in that crater, but those who worked closely with her noticed changes. She was more focused, more intuitive about when rescue operations would be needed. Some said she had an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone was in trouble in the desert's vast wilderness. They weren't entirely wrong. In the weeks following the sand demon's death, Elizabeth began experiencing dreams. Not nightmares, but visions of Death Valley from impossible perspectives. She could see the entire valley spread out like a map, could sense the location of every living thing within its boundaries. When hikers became lost or injured, she knew about it before their emergency beacons activated. At first, she thought it was just heightened awareness, a byproduct of trauma and stress. But as the phenomenon continued and strengthened, Elizabeth realized the truth. The sand demon's death had left a void in the desert's spiritual ecosystem, and somehow she was filling it. Unlike the malevolent entity she'd destroyed, Elizabeth's new connection to Death Valley was protective rather than predatory. She used her supernatural awareness to prevent tragedies rather than cause them, guiding rescue teams to victims with uncanny accuracy, and somehow knowing exactly when weather conditions would turn dangerous. The desert still claimed lives. It was Death Valley after all, and some natural laws couldn't be changed by good intentions. But the fatality rate dropped significantly under Elizabeth's watch, and the mysterious disappearances that had plagued the region for decades simply stopped. On quiet nights, when she walked the desert alone under star-filled skies, Elizabeth could feel the presence of everyone who had ever died in this place. But instead of the anguished chorus that had powered the sand demon, she sensed something closer to peace. The victims' stories were finally being honored rather than exploited, their deaths serving as warnings rather than lures for future prey. She still carried guilt about James Morrison. That wound might never fully heal, but she'd learned to transform that guilt into purpose, using her mistakes as fuel for better judgment rather than self-destruction. Every life she saved was a form of penance, but also a choice to create something positive from tragedy. 5 years after the incident in the crater, Elizabeth Stone remained head of Death Valley's emergency response operations. Officially, she was considered the most effective ranger in the Park Service's history. Unofficially, she had become something more, a bridge between the human world and the ancient forces that shaped the desert. Visitors sometimes reported seeing a woman in ranger uniform appear at crucial moments, offering water to the dehydrated or directions to the lost, only to vanish when they turned to thank her. Elizabeth never commented on these stories, but she knew they were true. Her connection to Death Valley had grown strong enough that she could manifest physically wherever she was needed most. She was no longer just protecting people from the desert. She had become part of the desert's own protective spirit, ensuring that its dangers remained honest rather than malicious. The Sand Demon had sought to make Death Valley more deadly through supernatural malevolence. Elizabeth's role was to make it appropriately dangerous through natural forces alone. Late at night, when she stood watch over the valley from her ranger station, Elizabeth sometimes heard James's voice carried on the desert wind. Not the guilt-inducing accusations the Sand Demon had used against her, but the real James, encouraging, proud, and grateful that she'd found a way to transform tragedy into purpose. "You did good, Liz," he would whisper through the sagebrush and ancient stones. "You figured out how to live with the guilt instead of dying from it." Elizabeth would smile and adjust her radio, listening for any emergency calls that might need her attention. She had forever to stand guard over Death Valley, forever to ensure that its spiritual balance remained intact. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the one she'd chosen through courage and sacrifice. And in the vast silence of the desert night, surrounded by stars that had watched over this place for millions of years, Elizabeth Stone found a peace she'd never expected to achieve. She had become what she'd always aspired to be, a protector of life in a place where death came easily, a guardian who understood that true strength lay not in conquering the wilderness, but in learning to coexist with its eternal, unforgiving beauty. The desert no longer screamed. It simply waited, patient and honest in its dangers, watched over by a woman who had learned that redemption came not from avoiding mistakes, but from ensuring they were never repeated. My name is Vincent Ashford, and I'm about to tell you the last story I'll ever tell. I'm 41 years old, and I've been a park ranger here at Algonquin Provincial Park for 8 years now. This place sits right on the border between Ontario and New York, and it's the most beautiful wilderness you've ever seen. At least it was beautiful until 3 days ago. I should start at the beginning, back when everything was still normal. It was late October, and I was doing my morning rounds around Mirror Lake. The sun wasn't even up yet, just that soft grey light that comes before dawn. Mist was rising off the water like ghosts dancing, and I could hear the Canadian geese calling to each other across the lake. It was peaceful, really peaceful. I'd been checking my trap lines since 4 in the morning. Not for animals, we don't hunt here, but for broken equipment, damaged signs, that sort of thing. The park covers over 2,000 acres in my section alone, and it's my job to keep it safe. In 8 years, I'd never lost a single hiker. I was proud of that. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the smell of pine needles and that earthy scent you only get in deep woods. A loon called out from somewhere across the water, that haunting sound that makes your skin tingle. Everything was perfect. For the first time in months, I felt truly at peace. You see, I haven't always been a park ranger. Before this, I was a soldier. I spent 2 years in Vietnam, crawling through tunnels that the Viet Cong had dug under the jungle. They called us tunnel rats. We'd go down into those dark, narrow spaces where bigger soldiers couldn't fit, looking for enemy fighters. And weapons. It was the worst job in the war. I lost a lot of friends down there, good men who never came home. My sergeant, Tommy Rodriguez, saved my life more times than I can count. He always carried this old brass compass that his grandfather had given him. "This will always point you home, Vincent," he used to say. "Tommy died when I triggered a booby trap. The explosion got him, but somehow I made it out. I still carry his compass. The war messed me up pretty bad. When I came home, I couldn't sleep without screaming. I'd wake up thinking I was still in those tunnels, with the walls closing in around me. My wife, Sarah, tried to help, but after a while she couldn't take it anymore. She left 3 years ago and took our twin daughters, Emma and Lucy, to California. I haven't seen them since. That's when I became a ranger. The wilderness helped quiet the nightmares. Out here with nothing but trees and lakes and clean air, I could finally breathe again. My German Shepherd Gunner was my only companion. He was a war dog too, retired like me. We understood each other. This morning felt different though. Good different. I was standing by the lake, watching the mist swirl over the water, and for the first time since the war, I felt truly calm. The nightmares had been quiet for almost a week. Maybe I was finally healing. Gunner was with me, sniffing around a fallen log near the water's edge. He was a big dog, black and tan with scars on his muzzle from his army days. That dog feared nothing. He'd been through 3 tours overseas and never backed down from anything. I was checking the compass, Tommy's compass, when everything changed. The sound stopped. I don't mean it got quiet. I mean every single sound just ended. The geese stopped calling. The loon went silent. Even the gentle lapping of water against the shore disappeared. It was like someone had turned off all the noise in the world. Gunner's head snapped up, his ears went flat against his skull, and a low whine escaped his throat. In all the years I'd known him, I'd never heard him make that sound. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My army training kicked in, and every sense went on high alert. Something was wrong, very wrong. I looked around, trying to figure out what had spooked us. The mist was getting thicker, rolling across the lake like a living thing. The temperature had dropped too. I could see my breath now, which was weird because it had been warm just minutes before. That's when I saw the tracks. They were in the mud by the lake shore, about 20 feet from where I was standing. Big tracks, bigger than any animal I knew. They looked almost human, but wrong somehow. Too long, too deep, and they just ended. Right at a solid rock face, like whatever made them had walked straight through stone. I'd done my evening patrol, yesterday, walking this exact same path. Those tracks hadn't been there then, I was sure of it. I tried my radio to call back to headquarters. All I got was static, loud, angry static that made my ears hurt. I was 40 miles from the nearest town, and the closest other ranger station was even further than that. Gunner was pressing against my leg now, trembling. This was a dog who'd faced enemy fire without flinching, and he was shaking like a leaf. I should have left then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back to my cabin, pack up and get out of the woods. But I couldn't. 8 years of keeping this place safe. 8 years of never losing anyone on my watch. I wasn't about to start running from some weird tracks and a spooked dog. I had to know what was out there. I pulled out my flashlight and checked the batteries. Fresh ones put in just yesterday. I clicked it on to test it, and the beam cut through the mist like a knife. Everything seemed normal. "Come on, boy," I said to Gunnar, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Let's go take a look." That was the last normal decision I ever made. I followed those strange tracks deeper into the woods, with Gunnar pressed close to my leg. The fog was getting thicker by the minute, and I had to use my flashlight even though it was morning. The beam cut through the mist, but it seemed weaker than it should be. That's when my flashlight started acting up. The beam flickered once, then twice, then went completely dark. I smacked it against my palm. Sometimes that works with old equipment. But nothing happened. I unscrewed the back and checked the batteries. They were the same ones I'd put in yesterday, fresh from the package. But now they felt cold in my hand, like they'd been sitting in a freezer. I tried my backup flashlight. Same thing, dead batteries that should have been good for hours. "This doesn't make sense," I said out loud, just to hear my own voice. The sound was swallowed by the fog almost immediately, like the mist was eating it up. Gunnar whined again, that awful sound I'd never heard him make before. When I looked down at him, I saw something that made my blood run cold. His nose was bleeding, just a little trickle of red that looked black in the strange grey light. I'd seen dogs get nosebleeds before, usually from dry air or bumping into something. But Gunnar's ears were bleeding too, just tiny drops from inside his ears. And his eyes looked scared in a way that made my chest tight. We kept walking, following the tracks through the fog. The forest felt wrong. I'd walked these same paths hundreds of times, but now they seemed different. Trees I'd known for years looked twisted, like they were reaching for me with their branches. The ground under my feet felt soft and squishy, even though there hadn't been any rain in weeks. Then I heard the voice. "Vincent." I stopped dead in my tracks. It was Tommy's voice. My old sergeant from Vietnam, clear as day. "Vincent, over here." It was coming from somewhere in the fog off to my right, but Tommy had been dead for 20 years. I'd watched him die in those tunnels. "Tommy?" I called out, even though I knew. "It was impossible. I've been waiting for you, Vincent. Come find me." My hands started shaking, not from the cold, but from something deeper. I pulled out Tommy's compass, the one I always carried, and the needle was spinning around and around, never stopping, never pointing north like it should. Gunnar was backing away from the sound, pulling against my leg. His whole body was shaking now, and more blood was coming from his nose. "It's okay, boy," I whispered, but I didn't believe it myself. The voices started multiplying. Tommy's voice, but also others. My ex-wife Sarah, calling my name like she used to when she was scared during my nightmares. My daughters Emma and Lucy, their little voices asking me to come home. "Daddy, where are you? We miss you so much. Vincent, please help us. We're lost. Come home, come home, come home." I knew none of it was real. These people were hundreds of miles away in California. But hearing their voices, especially my girls' voices, made something break inside my chest. The fog was so thick now I could barely see my own hands. I kept the flashlight on, even though it wasn't working, just holding it like it might protect me somehow. The temperature had dropped even more. I could see my breath in thick white puffs, and ice was starting to form. On my jacket, that's when I found the backpack. It was hanging from a tree branch about 15 feet off the ground. Not sitting on a branch, hanging from it like someone had thrown it up there with incredible force. The branch was thick, maybe 6 inches around, and the backpack was stuck on it like it had been impaled. I had to climb up to get a closer look. The bark was rough and cold against my hands, colder than it should have been. When I reached the backpack, I could see it was shredded. Long tears in the fabric, like something with huge claws had ripped it apart. Inside, I found a wallet with a driver's license. David Chen, age 28, from Seattle. The license photo showed a young guy with a big smile, the kind of person who probably loved hiking and camping, the kind of person I was supposed to keep safe. But there was blood on the wallet, fresh blood that was still wet. even though the license was dated 2 years ago. I climbed down fast, my heart pounding. Gunnar was waiting for me at the bottom of the tree, but something was wrong with him. He was standing perfectly still, like a statue, staring off into the fog. When I called his name, he didn't respond. Then I saw his paws. They were bleeding, like he'd been walking on broken glass. But the ground was just dirt and pine needles, nothing that should cut him up like that. I knelt down beside him. "Gunnar, what happened to you?" He looked at me then, and his eyes were different, still brown, still the same dog I'd known for years, but there was something else there now, like he was seeing things I couldn't see, terrible things that were hurting him just by looking at them. The voices came back, stronger this time. "Vincent, help me, I'm trapped. Daddy, something's chasing us. Please, Vincent, don't leave us." Here, I tried my radio again, desperate to reach someone, anyone. But instead of static, I heard something worse. I heard my own voice coming through the speaker, talking to someone I couldn't hear. "Day 3 in the woods," my voice said through the radio. "Still haven't found a way out. The thing is getting closer. If anyone finds this radio, don't come looking for me. Don't come into these woods. There's something here that shouldn't exist." But I hadn't been in the woods for 3 days. I'd only been out here for a couple of hours, and I'd never said those words. I turned the radio off, but my voice kept coming through anyway, saying things I'd never said, describing things that hadn't happened yet. The tracks were changing too. When I first found them, they looked almost human but too big. Now they were different every few feet. Sometimes they looked like giant wolf prints, sometimes like bear tracks, but wrong somehow. Too many claws, or claws that were too long. And sometimes they didn't look like any animal at all. But the worst part was how they seemed to know where I was going. The tracks would disappear for a while, then show up right in front of me, like whatever made them was watching me, waiting for me to follow them deeper into the woods. My watch had stopped working. The hands were frozen at 7:23, even though I could feel hours passing. When I looked up through the fog, trying to see the sun, there was nothing but grey. No light, no shadows, no way to tell what time it really was. Gunnar started walking away from me, heading toward a thick stand of pine trees, not running, just walking slow and steady, like someone was calling him. I followed, afraid to lose sight of him in the fog. "Gunnar, stay close," I called, but he didn't listen. Behind those trees I found something that made my skin crawl. Symbols carved into the bark, fresh cuts that were still bleeding sap. They weren't like any writing I'd ever seen, just shapes that hurt to look at, angles that seemed to fold in on themselves. And below each symbol, in the dirt, were more of those strange tracks. But these ones were arranged in a perfect circle, like whatever made them had been dancing around the trees. The fog was moving now, swirling around us like it was alive. And in that swirling mist, I started to see shapes, tall, thin shadows that moved too fast to be human. They were always at the edge of my vision, disappear whenever I tried to look directly at them. Gunnar had stopped walking. He was standing in the middle of the circle of tracks, still as stone, blood dripping steadily from his nose onto the ground. And that's when I realized the terrible truth. We weren't alone in these woods. We never had been. Something was hunting us. I was staring at Gunnar, trying to figure out why he wouldn't move, when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another shadow in the fog, something tall moving between the trees, maybe 30 feet away. I blinked and looked again, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But it was still there, and it was getting closer. The thing was huge, maybe 9 feet tall, but so thin it looked like a skeleton wrapped in pale skin. Its arms hung down almost to the ground, too long for its body, and its legs, they bent the wrong way, like they were put together by someone who'd never seen a human being before. But the worst part was its head. It had antlers like a deer, but they were cracked and broken. Pieces of bone hung down like dead branches. And its face, I can't describe its face without my hands shaking. It had no lips, just a mouthful of teeth that were too long and too sharp. Its eyes were holes in its skull, but something blue and cold burned inside them, like flames made of ice. I wanted to run. Every part of me was screaming to turn around and get out of those woods as fast as I could, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like the cold had frozen me in place. The thing took another step toward us, and I heard the sound its feet made in the dirt. Not normal footsteps, more like the crack of breaking bones. Each step sounded wrong, like it was walking on joints that shouldn't bend. That's when it spoke. Vincent! It was my daughter Lucy's voice coming out of that horrible mouth, sweet and small, just like when she was 6 years old and would climb into my lap to read bedtime stories. Daddy, why did you leave us? I felt tears on my face freezing before they could fall. You're not Lucy, I whispered. The thing's head tilted to one side like a curious dog. When it moved, I heard something else, a sound like wind through dry leaves, or maybe like someone very hungry licking their lips. I'm so cold, Daddy, and so hungry. Won't you help me? Now it was Emma's voice, my other daughter. The thing's mouth didn't match the words at all. The lips, if you could call them lips, weren't moving right for human speech. But the voice was perfect. Exactly like Emma when she was scared and needed her daddy. Come closer, Daddy. I need you. I took a step forward before I could stop myself. Some part of my brain, the part that still remembered being a father, wanted to help, wanted to comfort my little girl. But then Gunnar made a sound I'd never heard before. Not a bark or a whine. Something deeper, like a growl mixed with a scream. He was looking right at the thing, and every hair on his body was standing up. The creature looked at Gunnar, and its burning eyes got brighter. The animal sees clearly, it said, and now it was using its own voice. It sounded like wind through a graveyard, dry and empty and very old. Animals always do. Gunnar took a step toward the thing, not like he wanted to attack it, more like he couldn't control his own body. His legs were shaking, but he kept walking forward. No, I said. Gunnar, come back here. But my dog couldn't hear me anymore. The thing was calling to him somehow, pulling him closer. I could see Gunnar fighting it, trying to stop, but his paws kept moving in the dirt. The creature reached out one of its long arms. Its fingers were like sticks, with nails that looked more like claws. When it touched Gunnar's head, my dog went completely still. For a moment, nothing happened. The three of us just stood there in the fog. Me, my dog, and this thing that shouldn't exist. Then Gunnar started changing. His fur began falling out in chunks, leaving bare skin that looked grey and cold. His eyes rolled back in his head until only the whites showed, and his mouth opened too wide like his jaw was breaking. Stop it, I said louder now. Leave him alone. The thing looked at me and smiled. At least, I think it was smiling. Its mouth got wider, showing more of those needle teeth. He will feed me first, it said. Then you will feed me. Then I will wear your skin and walk among the warm ones, spreading the hunger. I pulled out my knife. Not much of a weapon, but it was all I had. The blade felt cold in my hand, so cold it almost burned to touch. The creature laughed. The sound was like breaking glass mixed with a baby crying. It hurt my ears so much I almost dropped the knife. Iron cannot bite the winter's child, it said. Fire cannot warm the long hunger. You have nothing that can hurt me, Vincent Ashford. It knew my name, my full name, the one only my family used. How could it know that? But I know you, it continued. I have watched you sleep. I have tasted your dreams. You dream of the tunnels, don't you? The dark places where your friends died screaming. Suddenly I wasn't in the woods anymore. I was back in Vietnam, crawling through a tunnel so narrow I could barely move. The walls were closing in around me, and I could hear enemy soldiers talking somewhere in the darkness ahead. But this wasn't just a memory. This was real. I could smell the damp earth, feel the sweat running down my back, taste the fear in my mouth like copper pennies. "Tommy!" I called out just like I had 20 years ago. "I'm here, Vincent." His voice came from somewhere behind me. "I'm right behind you. Don't leave me in the dark." I tried to turn around, but the tunnel was too narrow. I was stuck, and the walls were getting smaller. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, Then I was back in the woods. The creature was closer now, maybe 10 feet away. Gunnar was on the ground, not moving. I couldn't tell if he was breathing. "You see," the thing said, "your mind is already mine. Your fear feeds me more than flesh ever could." The trees around us started changing. Their bark turned white like bone, and their branches reached down toward me like grabbing hands. The ground under my feet felt soft and wet, like I was standing on something that used to be alive. "This is my place now," the creature said. "These woods belong to the hunger. Every animal that runs here runs to me. Every human that walks here walks into my mouth." I looked around and realized something terrible. The trees weren't just white, they were made of bones, human bones, stacked and twisted together to look like tree trunks, and hanging from the bone branches were pieces of clothing, backpacks, shoes, things that had belonged to hikers who never made it home. "How many?" I asked. "How many have I eaten?" The thing's head tilted again. Time moves strangely when you are very old. Decades feel like days. I've been hungry for so very long. I understood then, this wasn't some animal that had wandered into the park. This was something ancient, something that had been here long before there were any parks or rangers or people trying to keep others safe. The fog was moving around us in circles now, and I could see shapes in it. People-shaped shadows that moved wrong, like they were walking underwater. More of its victims maybe, or just more tricks to mess with my head. "Join them," the creature said, and its voice was getting softer, almost gentle. "Stop fighting. Stop hurting. The hunger ends all pain." For a second I almost listened. I was tired of fighting, tired of the nightmares and the guilt and the loneliness. Maybe it would be easier to just give up. But then I looked at Gunnar, lying so still in the dirt. My loyal dog who had never hurt anyone, who had served his country just like I had. This thing had hurt him just to get to me. That made me angry, really angry. "No," I said, and my voice sounded stronger than it had in years. "I'm not giving up, and I'm not letting you hurt anyone else." The creature's burning eyes flared brighter. "Then you will die slowly, Vincent Ashford. You will die knowing that your pain feeds my strength." It raised one of those long arms, fingers spread like claws. The air around me started to freeze, ice forming on my jacket and in my hair, but I was ready now. I had been in bad situations before. I had survived the tunnels and the war and losing my family. I could survive this too. I just had to figure out how. The ice was spreading up my arms now, cold enough to burn. I could feel my fingers going numb inside my gloves. But I remembered something from my army training. Fire was always the answer. When you were trapped by the cold, I reached into my pack and pulled out my emergency flare. The red tube felt warm in my frozen hands, like it still held some heat from the real world. The creature saw what I was doing and made that terrible laughing sound again. "Fire," it said. "You think your little flame can hurt the endless winter?" I pulled the cap off the flare and struck it. Nothing happened. I tried again, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold it. Still nothing. The creature took another step closer. "Even your fire fears me, Vincent." But on the third try, the flare caught. A bright red flame shot out, hissing and crackling. The light was so sudden and warm that I almost cried with relief. The creature stepped back, just one step, but it was something. The ice on my arms stopped spreading. "Get away from me," I said, holding the flare out like a weapon. The thing's burning eyes got smaller, like it was squinting. Clever little flame. But fire dies, Vincent. Fire always dies. It was right. The flare would only last a few minutes, but maybe that would be enough time to think of something else. I started backing away, keeping the flare pointed at the creature. It followed me, but slowly, staying just outside the circle of red light. I could hear it breathing, a sound like wind through a broken window. Behind me I heard the sound of running water, a stream maybe, or the edge of the lake. If I could get to water, maybe I could get away. The creature was tall and thin. It might not be able to swim, but when I turned around, I realized I was trapped. I wasn't by the lake anymore. Somehow, without noticing, I had walked into a cave. The walls were solid rock on both sides, and the only way out was the way I had come in. The creature was blocking that path now, filling the cave mouth with its horrible shape. My breathing got fast and shallow. The cave walls seemed to be moving, getting closer together. I knew it was just my mind playing tricks, the same claustrophobia that had haunted me since the war, but knowing that didn't make it any easier. I was back in the tunnels, trapped underground with no way out, and something deadly hunting me in the dark. "You remember, don't you?" the creature said, and now it was using Tommy's voice again. "You remember how it felt when the walls started closing in, how you couldn't breathe, how you thought you were going to die down there in the dark." The flare in my hand was getting smaller. I could feel the heat from it starting to fade. "Remember how you left me, Vincent," Tommy's voice continued. "Remember how you triggered that trap and ran away while I died screaming." "That's not what happened," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to me. "Isn't it?" Now the creature was right in front of me, close enough that I could smell it. It smelled like old meat and wet dirt and something else, something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in a grave. The flare went out. In the sudden darkness, I heard the creature moving closer. Its claws scraped against the stone walls of the cave, making a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. I fumbled in my pack for another flare, but my hands were shaking too much. Everything felt wrong in the dark. My pack seemed bigger than it should be, like my hands were getting smaller, or like the pack was growing while I wasn't looking. "Vincent." Now it was Sarah's voice, my ex-wife, soft and sad, the way she sounded the night she told me she was leaving. "Why couldn't you just get better? Why couldn't you come back to us?" I found another flare and lit it. The red light flared up again, pushing back the darkness. But when I looked around, the cave had changed. The walls were covered with pictures now, scratched into the stone like cave paintings, but fresh, like someone had just carved them. They showed stick figures of people being torn apart by something with long arms and antlers. Men, women, children, all of them with their mouths open in silent screams. "My gallery," the creature said, and now it was using its own voice again. "Every meal I have ever taken. Would you like to see your portrait?" On the wall next to me, a new picture was appearing, being carved by invisible hands right before my eyes. It showed a man with my face, my hair, my clothes, and standing over him was the creature, its mouth open wide. But in the picture, I looked different, older. My hair was completely white instead of gray, and my face was covered in wrinkles. I looked like an old man, maybe 80 years old. "What is that?" I asked. "Your future," the creature said. "What you will look like when I am done with you. The hunger ages everything it touches, Vincent. It will take years from your life before it takes your life itself." I looked down at my hands in the flare light. The skin looked different, looser, more wrinkled than it had been this morning. My wedding ring, which had always fit perfectly, was sliding around on my finger like it was too big. "No," I whispered. "Yes," the creature said. "You feel it, don't you? Time moving differently here. Minutes becoming hours, hours becoming years. I have been feeding on your life force since the moment you entered my woods. Soon you will be too old and weak to run, and then the real feeding will begin." I tried to think. My mind felt slow and fuzzy, like I was thinking through thick fog. But I remembered something from the old stories, the ones the Native American guides used to tell around campfires. Stories about creatures like this one. Fire was good, but it wasn't enough. You needed more than just fire to stop something that had been alive for centuries. You needed to trap it, or bury it, or find some way to make sure it couldn't hurt anyone. Else, I looked up at the cave ceiling. It was lower than I thought, maybe only 8 feet high, and the rock looked old and cracked, like it might not be very stable. "You know what I think?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think you're not as strong as you pretend to be." The creature's eyes flared brighter. "What?" "If you were really that powerful, you wouldn't need to hide in caves and fog. You wouldn't need to play games with people's minds. You'd just kill them and be done with it." "I am ancient," the creature snarled. "I am hunger itself. I am—" "You're scared," I said, and suddenly I knew it was true. You're scared because the world is changing. There are fewer places to hide, fewer people who believe in monsters. You're dying, aren't you? That's why you need to feed so badly." The creature roared, and the sound was so loud it hurt my ears. But I also heard something else, the sound of loose rock falling from the ceiling. The cave was unstable, and this thing was old and heavy, and probably didn't know much about modern explosives. I reached into my pack and pulled out the last thing I had that might work, a small camping gas canister that I used for my portable stove. It was half full, enough to make a pretty good bang if I could figure out how to set it off. "What are you doing?" the creature asked. "Something I learned in the army," I said. "Something about bringing down tunnels." I twisted the valve on the gas canister and threw it as hard as I could at the cave wall. At the same time, I lit my last flare and threw that too. The creature realized what I was doing, a second too late. It lunged at me, those long claws reaching for my throat. The explosion was louder than anything I'd ever heard. The explosion knocked me flat on my back. My ears were ringing so loud I couldn't hear anything else. Chunks of rock fell from the ceiling, some as big as footballs. I rolled to the side just as a piece the size of a car tire crashed down where my head had been. Dust filled the air, thick and choking. I couldn't see anything through it. For a moment I thought maybe I had done it. Maybe I had brought down enough of the cave to trap the creature. Then I heard it laughing. The sound came from everywhere at once, echoing off the cave walls. The creature was hurt. I could tell that much, but it wasn't dead. Nothing that old and evil was going to die from a simple camping gas explosion. "Clever," its voice said through the dust. "Very clever, Vincent, but not clever enough." I tried to sit up, but something was wrong, really wrong. My back felt like it was on fire, and when I reached around to touch it, my hand came away wet. Blood. A piece of shrapnel had cut me pretty deep. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how tired I felt. Not just tired from the explosion, but tired in my bones, like I'd been awake for days. My hands looked even older now, the skin loose and spotted with age marks that hadn't been there an hour ago. I was dying, not from the cut on my back, but from whatever the creature was doing to me. It was eating my life, year by year, and I could feel each one disappearing. "You understand now," the creature said. I could see its shape moving through the dust, tall and wrong. One of its arms hung at a funny angle. The explosion had hurt it after all. "You cannot fight time itself. You cannot fight the hunger that has existed since the world was young." I struggled to my feet. Everything hurt, but I had to keep moving. Through the settling dust, I could see that part of the cave ceiling had collapsed. Not enough to trap the creature, but maybe enough to block the way out. That gave me an idea. A terrible idea, but maybe the only one I had left. "You're right," I said, trying to catch my breath. "I can't fight you. I'm just a man, and you're something much older and stronger." The creature stopped moving. "You accept your fate." "I accept that I'm going to die in this cave," I said. "But I don't accept that you're going to walk out of here and hurt other people." I reached into my jacket and pulled out the one thing I'd been saving for the very end. 3 small charges of C4 explosive that I'd been carrying for avalanche control work. Military grade, enough to bring down a whole mountainside if placed right. The creature saw what I was holding, and its burning eyes got brighter. Those will not hurt me, Vincent. Nothing you have will hurt me. Maybe not, I said, but they'll hurt this cave, and if I place them right, they'll bring down the whole ceiling, bury both of us under about 1,000,000 tons of rock. For the first time since I'd seen it, the creature looked worried. You would kill yourself, I thought about that, would I? A few hours ago, the answer would have been no. I had things to live for. My job, my responsibility to keep the park safe. Maybe even the hope that someday I might see my daughters again. But now I looked like I was 80 years old. My hair was completely white, my face was covered in wrinkles, and I could feel my heart struggling to keep beating in my chest. The creature had already killed me. I was just choosing how to die. I've been dead since I walked into these woods, I said. Haven't I? The creature didn't answer, but I could see the truth in its burning eyes. I had died in that first moment when I saw it by the lake. Everything since then, the chase, the cave, the fighting, it had all been happening to a dead man who just didn't know it yet. How long? I asked. Hours, the creature said. You died when you chose to follow the tracks instead of fleeing. Everything since then has been me playing with your dying mind. I nodded. That made sense, in a horrible way. It explained why nothing had worked quite right, why my equipment kept failing, why the forest had seemed to change around me. I wasn't really in the woods anymore. I was in some space between life and death, and the creature was keeping me there for its own amusement. But your death can still have meaning, the creature continued. Join me willingly, and I will let you see your family again. I will show you Sarah and Emma and Lucy, and you can be with them forever. For a moment, I wavered. The idea of seeing my girls again, of holding them and telling them how sorry I was for all the times I hadn't been there, it was almost too much to resist. But then I remembered Gunnar, lying still in the dirt. I remembered all the other people who had disappeared in these woods over the years, hikers who never came home, families who never got to say goodbye. No, I said. They're not really my family. They're just more of your tricks. I started placing the charges, working as fast as my old hands could manage. The creature watched me, but it didn't try to stop me. Maybe it was curious to see what I would do. Maybe it thought the explosives really couldn't hurt it. Why? It asked. Why choose death over eternal life? Why choose pain over peace? I finished placing the last charge and looked up at the creature. Even hurt and trapped, it was still the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. But I wasn't scared anymore. Funny how being dead already made you less afraid of dying, because somebody has to, I said. Because if I don't stop you here, you'll keep killing people. And because sometimes doing the right thing costs everything. You have. I thought about Tommy, who had died trying to save me in those tunnels 20 years ago. I thought about all the soldiers I'd known who had given their lives so others could live. Maybe this was my chance to join them, to finally do something worth dying for. You will be forgotten, the creature said. No one will ever know what you did here. Maybe, I said, but they'll be alive to forget me, and that's enough. I pressed. The detonator. The second explosion was bigger than the first, much bigger. The whole cave shook like an earthquake, and I could hear the mountain itself groaning as tons of rock shifted overhead. Cracks appeared in the walls, spreading like spider webs. The creature screamed, not in anger this time, but in fear. Real fear. It had finally realized that I was serious, that I really was going to bring the whole place down on both of us. Wait, it said, but its voice was getting weaker. We can make a bargain. I can give you back your youth, your life. I can reunite you with your family. The ceiling started to fall, big chunks of stone, then whole sections of rock. I closed my eyes and thought about Emma and Lucy, my real daughters, safe in California. I thought about all the people who would visit these woods in the years to come, families having picnics by the lake, kids learning to fish, hikers watching the sunrise from the mountaintops. They would be safe. The creature would be buried here. With me trapped under the mountain until the rocks eroded away. That might take hundreds of years, maybe thousands. Long enough for people to forget about monsters and wendigos and things that hunted in the dark. A chunk of rock hit my shoulder, then another. I could feel the mountain falling down around me, but I wasn't scared. I was thinking about Tommy's compass still in my pocket and how it had finally brought me home. Not home to my family, I'd lost that chance years ago, but home to the place where I belonged, where I could finally do some good with my death. The last thing I remember was the creature's scream cutting off suddenly, and then the sound of silence, real silence, the kind that comes when something very old and very evil finally stops breathing. 3 days later, they found the avalanche site. The whole side of the mountain had come down, burying the cave and everything in it under thousands of tons of rock. The rescue team spent weeks looking for me, but they never found my body. The official report said I died in a natural rock slide while investigating reports of missing hikers. They put up a memorial plaque by the lake with my name and the words, "He died protecting the wilderness he loved." But sometimes, on cold October mornings when the fog rolls in thick over Mirror Lake, hikers report hearing a voice in the mist. A man's voice calling out warnings to stay on the trails, to turn back if the woods feel wrong, to never follow strange tracks into places where the silence is too deep. They say the voice sounds tired but determined, like someone who has been keeping watch for a very long time. Rangers investigate these reports, but they never find anything except unusually cold air and places where the compasses spin wildly for no reason anyone can explain. The missing hikers from previous years were never found, but no one has disappeared in those woods since. The creature sleeps under the mountain, and I keep watch above it, making sure it stays asleep. It's not the life I planned, but it's the one I chose. And every morning, when the sun rises over the lake and families arrive to camp and fish and enjoy the wilderness, I know it was worth it. Some prices are worth paying, some deaths have meaning. And sometimes, if you listen very carefully on quiet mornings in Algonquin Park, you can still hear me doing my job, keeping people safe, keeping the darkness buried, keeping watch until the end of time. My name is Jonathan Blackthorne, and I should have listened to my gut that morning. Something felt wrong about going into the deep caves, but I ignored it. I was a fool. It was October 1971, and the leaves above Mammoth Cave were turning golden. Down here in Kentucky, autumn was beautiful, but 400 feet underground, seasons don't matter. It's always dark, always cold, always quiet. I was 39 years old and had been guiding cave tours for 5 years. Before that, I worked in coal mines for 15 years until everything went wrong. That's a story I don't like telling, but the caves made me feel safe again. Funny thing is, caves and mines aren't that different. Both are holes in the ground where the sun never shines. That day, I was taking 4 people into a section of Mammoth Cave that most tourists never see. These weren't tourists, though. They were serious cavers, people who loved crawling through tight spaces and exploring places where no human had ever been. There was Dr. Sarah Chen, a geology professor from Louisville. She was small and tough, perfect for cave work. Then we had Mike and Lisa Rodriguez, a married couple from Texas who spent their vacations underground. Finally, there was Tommy Morrison, just 22 years old and full of energy. He reminded me of myself when I was young and stupid. "Everyone check your gear one more time," I said as we stood at the cave entrance. "We're going places where your light dies, you die. No second chances down there." I watched them go through their equipment, carbide headlamps, the best we had in 1971, extra batteries for the electric lights, rope, first aid kit, water and food for 8 hours underground. Everything looked good. "Mr. Blackthorne," Tommy said, bouncing on his feet like a kid, "how deep are we going today?" About 400 feet down, I answered. Through passages that were mapped just last year. Some chambers are so big you can't see the walls with your light. Sarah looked excited. I've read about the limestone formations down there. Millions of years old, right? I nodded. The rock down there was made when Kentucky was under an ocean. You'll see fossils in the walls, ancient sea creatures trapped in stone. We started walking into the cave. The temperature dropped immediately. Outside, it was 65 degrees. Down here, it was always 54 degrees, no matter what season. The air felt different too, thick and damp, like breathing through wet cloth. Our lights cut through the darkness as we walked deeper. The cave walls were smooth limestone, carved by water over millions of years. Everything was grey and white, like walking through a black and white photograph. Stay close, I called back to the group. This isn't like the tourist caves. No handrails, no electric lights, just us and the rock. For the first hour, everything was normal. We saw the usual cave things, stalactites hanging down like stone icicles, flowstone that looked like frozen waterfalls, underground pools that reflected our lights like mirrors. The group was having fun, taking pictures and asking questions. But then we reached the first chamber I'd never seen before. It was huge. Our lights couldn't reach the ceiling or the far walls. The floor was covered in broken rock and something else. What are those? Lisa whispered, pointing her light at the ground. I looked closer and felt my stomach drop. Bones. Old bones scattered across the chamber floor like someone had thrown them there. But they weren't animal bones. Are those... Mike started to ask. Human, I said quietly. Very old human bones. Tommy laughed nervously. Come on, Mr. Blackthorne. You're trying to scare us, right? I wasn't trying to scare anyone. I was scared myself. In 5 years of guiding caves, I'd never seen anything like this. The bones were arranged in small piles, like someone had put them there on purpose. Around each pile, rocks were placed in perfect circles. We should go back, Sarah said. Her voice was shaky. No, I said, though part of me agreed with her. We came here to explore. These bones are probably from Native Americans who used these caves hundreds of years ago. Nothing to worry about, but I was lying. Something about this chamber felt wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. Even our breathing seemed too loud. We walked carefully around the bone piles and kept going deeper. The passages got narrower and we had to crawl through some sections. My carbide lamp made shadows dance on the walls, and more than once I thought I saw faces in the rock. Hey, Jonathan, Mike called from behind me. Does the air smell weird to you? I stopped and sniffed. He was right. There was a smell I didn't recognize. Sweet but rotten, like fruit that had gone bad. It was getting stronger as we went deeper. Probably just cave gases, I said. Nothing dangerous. Another lie. I'd been in enough caves and mines to know what dangerous gases smelled like. This was something else, something that made my skin crawl. We kept going. We had to. I was the guide, and these people trusted me. I couldn't let them down. Not again. But as we went deeper into the earth, farther from the sun and safety, I started to remember why I'd left the mines. Why I'd started drinking, why my wife had taken our son and left. Some holes in the ground should stay empty. Some darkness should never be disturbed. I was about to learn that lesson all over again. 2 hours into the cave, we found the second chamber. This one was different, wrong. The bones here weren't just scattered around. They were placed carefully, like someone had built something with them. Small piles in perfect circles, with rocks stacked between them. It looked like altars. That's the only word I could think of. This is impossible, Sarah whispered, kneeling next to one of the bone circles. The cave maps say no one has ever been in this section before. I checked my own map with my flashlight. She was right. According to the Park Service, we were in unexplored territory, but someone had definitely been here before us. A long time ago. Maybe the maps are wrong, Tommy said, but his voice was shaky now. The excitement from earlier was gone. I was staring at the bone arrangements when something hit me like a punch to the gut. The way they were laid out, It reminded me of something I'd tried to forget. March 15th, 1966. The Harlan County Mine. We were 200 feet down when I heard the first crack. The memory came back so fast, it made me dizzy. I put my hand against the cave wall to steady myself. "Jonathan, you okay?" Lisa asked. "I'm fine," I lied, but I wasn't fine. Being this deep underground was bringing it all back. The sounds, the fear, the way the rock fell. I should have called for evacuation. The support beams were making noise they shouldn't make, but the coal vein was so rich, and the bosses wanted more. "Just a few more hours," I told my crew. "Just a little more." "Let's keep moving," I said quickly. I needed to get out of this chamber, away from the bones that looked too much like the way I'd found my crew after the collapse. We walked into the next passage, and that's when our equipment started acting up. Mike's headlamp flickered and went out. "Damn thing was working fine a minute ago," he muttered, tapping it. The light came back on, but dimmer than before. Then Sarah's rope started fraying. She was checking her gear when she noticed it. "Look at this," she said, holding up the rope. "It looks like it's been cut with a knife." But no one had touched her rope. We'd all been together the whole time. "Cave air can be rough on equipment," I said, though I'd never seen anything like it. "The humidity down here eats through everything." Lisa's compass was spinning in circles. "This doesn't make sense," she said. "Compasses don't just break like this." I looked at my own compass. It was doing the same thing, the needle spinning like a crazy top, never stopping, never pointing north. "Must be iron ore in the rocks," I said. "Messes with magnetic fields." But I was starting to run out of explanations. In 15 years of mining and 5 years of cave guiding, I'd never seen equipment fail like this. Not all at once. Not for no reason. The passage we were following started to change shape. At first it was normal, rough walls carved by water over thousands of years. But as we went deeper, the walls became too smooth, too straight, like someone had cut them with tools. "Look at these walls," Tommy said, running his hand along the stone. "They're almost perfectly flat." He was right. The limestone looked carved, not natural. But limestone caves weren't carved by people. They were made by water, slowly eating through rock over millions of years. "Water can make strange shapes," I said, but even I didn't believe it anymore. The air was getting colder too. My breath started making little clouds in front of my face. That wasn't normal either. Caves were supposed to stay the same temperature year-round. "Is it just me, or is it freezing in here?" Lisa asked, zipping up her jacket. "Caves can have cold spots," I said. "Air comes in from deeper passages." But this cold felt different. It felt angry, like winter wind, but underground where winter couldn't reach. That's when we heard the first echo that wasn't ours. We had stopped to rest and drink some water. The cave was dead silent except for our breathing and the drip of water somewhere in the darkness. Then Tommy said something to Sarah, and when his voice echoed back, it sounded wrong. Instead of one echo, there were 3. And they didn't sound like Tommy's voice. They sounded like different people. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, looking around nervously. "Hear what?" Tommy said. But when his words echoed back this time, one of the echoes sounded like a woman's voice. I felt sweat on my face despite the cold. This was impossible. Echoes don't change voices. They just bounce sound off walls. "We need to be quieter," I said. "Sound carries far in caves like this." But I was thinking about the mining accident again. How we heard voices calling for help from under the collapsed rock. How some of those voices didn't belong to my crew. Billy Morrison had been crushed instantly when the ceiling came down, but I swear I heard him calling my name for 3 hours after we found his body. "Jonathan," Mike said quietly. "Look at this." He was pointing his light at the wall. In the stone, I could see shapes that looked like faces, dozens of them carved into the limestone. But they weren't peaceful faces. They looked scared, terrified. Their mouths were open like they were screaming. Those are just rock formations, I said quickly. Water carves all kinds of shapes, but they look too real, too detailed. And they were all looking at us. The smell was getting stronger too. That sweet, rotten smell like bad fruit. But now there was something else mixed in. Something that smelled like meat that had been left out too long. Maybe we should head back, Sarah said. We've been down here 3 hours. People will start worrying. Part of me wanted to agree. Every instinct I had was telling me to get out, to run back to the surface and sunlight and safety. But I thought about my crew again. How I'd failed them by being scared when I should have been brave. How I'd let them down when they needed me most. We're fine, I said. Just a little farther. I want to see what's in the next chamber. I was lying again. I didn't want to see what was in the next chamber. I was terrified of what we might find, but I couldn't fail another group of people who trusted me. I couldn't run away again, so we kept going deeper into the earth, following passages that shouldn't exist, past carvings that couldn't be real, breathing air that smelled like death, and somewhere in the darkness ahead of us, something was waiting. 4 hours underground, and everything started falling apart. It began with Tommy's headlamp dying completely. Not flickering this time, just dead. 1 second it was on, the next second we heard him curse in the darkness behind us. "Battery's fresh," he said, his voice tight. "Changed it this morning." I turned around to help him, and that's when I saw Mike's rope. It wasn't just fraying anymore. It looked like something had been chewing on it. The fibers were torn and twisted, hanging in shreds. "What the hell happened to your rope?" I asked. Mike held it up to his light. His face went pale. "I don't know. It was fine when we stopped for water. Sarah's compass wasn't just spinning now. It was spinning so fast, the needle was a blur. And Lisa's backup flashlight wouldn't turn on at all, even with new batteries. "This doesn't make sense," Lisa said, shaking her flashlight. "All our gear can't break at the same time." But it was happening, right in front of us. The cold was getting worse too. We could all see our breath now, little white clouds in the beam of our lights. But caves don't get cold like this. They stay the same temperature all year. "There must be an opening to the surface somewhere," I said. "Cold air coming down from outside." But I knew that wasn't true. We were 400 feet underground. No surface. Opening could make it this cold down here. That's when Tommy started acting strange. We were walking through a narrow passage when he suddenly stopped. He put his hand on the wall and tilted his head like he was listening to something. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. "Hear what?" Sarah asked. "The voices. They're calling from inside the rock." I felt my stomach drop. "Tommy, there are no voices. It's just water dripping." But Tommy wasn't listening to me. He pressed his ear against the wall. "They're trapped," he said. "They want out." "Tommy, step away from the wall," I said firmly. "You're just tired. The cave air can mess with your head." He looked at me, and his eyes were different. Wild. Scared. "You can't hear them? They're screaming, Jonathan. They've been screaming for so long." Mike grabbed Tommy's arm. "Come on, buddy, let's keep moving." But Tommy pulled away and started clawing at the wall with his fingernails. "We have to help them. They're right here, right behind the rock." "Tommy, stop!" I grabbed his hands. His fingernails were bleeding from scratching the stone. "Let me go!" he shouted. "They know what happened to your mining crew, Jonathan. They want to tell you." The words hit me like a slap. I'd never told any of them about the mining accident. Never mentioned my crew. How could he know? "Tommy, how do you know about that?" I asked quietly. He stopped struggling and stared at me. "Billy Morrison says hello. He says it wasn't your fault." I let go of his hands so fast he almost fell. Billy Morrison was the name of one of my miners, the youngest one. The one who died because I was too greedy to call for evacuation. "You can't know that name," I whispered. Tommy smiled, but it wasn't his smile. It was wrong. Too wide. "He's standing right behind you, Jonathan. He wants you to turn around." I didn't turn around. I couldn't, because part of me was afraid of what I might see. "We're leaving," I said. "Right now. Everyone back the way we came, but when I turned around, the passage we'd come through was gone. Instead of the tunnel we'd walked through, there was just solid rock wall. "That's impossible," Sarah said, touching the wall where the passage used to be. "We just came through here." Lisa was turning in circles, shining her light everywhere. "Where's the way out? Where's the tunnel?" I checked my map, but it didn't help. According to the map, we shouldn't even be here. This chamber wasn't supposed to exist. "Everyone stay calm," I said, though I was anything but calm. Caves can be confusing. We just took a wrong turn. But I knew we hadn't taken a wrong turn. The passage had been there 5 minutes ago. Now it was gone. That's when our lights started acting up. My flashlight beam bent to the left when I pointed it straight ahead. Sarah's light showed a tunnel that wasn't there when she turned her head. Lisa's light made shadows that moved by themselves. Shadows of people who weren't in our group. "This isn't real," Mike said, his voice shaking. "Lights don't bend. Shadows don't move on their own." But they were, right in front of us. Tommy had stopped clawing at the walls, but now he was speaking, in the language I'd never heard. The words sounded old, ancient, and wrong. "Tommy, what are you saying?" Sarah asked. He looked at her with those wild eyes. "They're teaching me, the people in the walls. They know things, old things." "What people?" I demanded. "There are no people in the walls." "Your mining crew is here too," he said to me. "All 7 of them. They followed you down here. They want to know why you left them to die." "Stop it!" I shouted. "Stop talking!" But Tommy kept going. Jim Parker, Frank Williams, Bobby Chen, Pete Rodriguez, Danny Morrison, Tom Jackson, and Billy, sweet little Billy, only 19 years old. He knew all their names, every single one, names I'd never spoken out loud since the accident. "How?" I whispered. "They told me," Tommy said simply. "They're all around us, Jonathan. They want justice." The cold was so bad now that ice was forming on the cave walls. Our breath came out in thick white clouds, and in those clouds I started to see faces, just for a second, just at the edge of my vision. Faces I recognized. "We need to find another way out," I said quickly. "Everyone stay together. Don't split up." But as we started walking, looking for another passage, I realized something terrible. The cave was changing around us. Passages that had been straight were now curved. Chambers that had been small were now huge. Tunnels that had been wide were now so narrow we had to crawl. It was like the cave was alive, like it was moving. And somewhere in the darkness, just at the edge of our failing lights, something was moving with it. Something big, something hungry, something that had been waiting in these caves for a very long time. 5 hours underground, and we were lost. Not just lost in the cave, lost in something that wasn't a cave anymore. The walls kept changing. Passages opened where there had been solid rock. Tunnels closed behind us like doors slamming shut. Tommy had gone quiet, but his eyes kept darting around like he was watching people we couldn't see. Sometimes he'd nod at empty spaces or mouth words to the air. "We need to find a way up," Sarah said. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the fear underneath. "We need to get back to the surface." I checked my compass again, still spinning. My map was useless now. We were in places that didn't exist on paper. "There," Lisa pointed to a passage that looked like it went upward. "That one slopes up. Maybe it leads to an exit." We started walking toward it, but as we got closer, the passage moved. I'm not talking about it looking different from another. It actually moved, slid to the right like a door opening. "Did you see that?" Mike whispered. "We all saw it. We all pretended we didn't." "Just a trick of the light," I said. But my voice cracked when I said it. We kept walking, and that's when we heard the first sound that didn't come from us. A scraping noise, like fingernails on rock. Long, slow scrapes that echoed through the tunnels. "What was that?" Sarah asked. I stopped walking and listened. The scraping came again, closer this time. It sounded like something big, dragging itself across stone. "Probably just rock settling," I said. "Old caves make noise. But rocks don't sound like that. They don't sound like something alive." Tommy suddenly grabbed my arm. "It's coming," he whispered. "It knows we're here." "What's coming?" I asked. "The hungry one. The one that's been waiting." Before I could ask what he meant, our lights went out, all of them. At the same time, we were in complete darkness, the kind of dark that you can't imagine unless you've been deep underground. So dark it felt heavy. So dark it pressed against. Your eyes like a weight. "Everyone stay calm," I said into the blackness. "Check your lights, tap them. Sometimes that helps." I heard clicking and tapping as everyone tried to get their lights working. Nothing happened. That's when we heard breathing that wasn't ours. Slow, deep breaths coming from somewhere in the darkness ahead of us. Each breath sounded wet, like the thing breathing had water in its lungs. "Jonathan," Lisa whispered. "What is that?" I didn't answer because I didn't know, but whatever was breathing wasn't human. The breaths were too long, too deep, like something with lungs the size of barrels. Then Tommy's light came back on. Just his. The beam was weak and yellow, barely lighting up the space in front of us, and in that weak light, we saw it. It was tall, taller than any person should be, maybe 8 feet, maybe more. It was thin, too, so thin I could see its ribs through pale skin that looked like old paper. Its arms were too long. They hung down past its knees, ending in fingers that looked more like claws. Its face was the worst part. It had been human once, maybe, but now it was something else. The skin was stretched too tight over sharp bones. Its mouth was too wide, full of teeth that were too long. But its eyes were the thing that made me want to run. They were black. Not dark brown or deep blue, black like the cave around us. And they were looking right at me. "Hello, Jonathan," it said. Its voice sounded like rocks grinding together, like the sound the mine made right before it collapsed. "You can't be real," I whispered. "Real?" The thing tilted its head. "I've been real for a very long time. Longer than your people have. Walked on the earth above." Sarah made a small noise behind me. I could hear the others breathing fast, scared. "What are you?" I asked. "I am hunger," it said simply. "I am the empty space that needs to be filled. I am what happens when people go too long without food, without hope, without light." The thing stepped forward and I saw how it moved. It didn't walk like a person. It flowed like water running downhill. And when it moved, the cave walls moved with it. "This is my home," it said. "These tunnels, these chambers, I made them with my need, carved them with my hunger. People come down here sometimes. They get lost, they get scared, they get hungry." "We're not lost," I said. "We know the way out," the thing laughed. The sound made my teeth hurt. "The way out," it said. "Jonathan, there is no way out, not anymore. You came too deep. You found my home. Now you're part of it." As it spoke, I heard voices coming from the walls around us. Familiar voices. "Jonathan, why did you leave us? We trusted you, boss. You could have saved us. My mining crew, they were in the walls, just like Tommy said." "Billy," I called out. "Billy, is that you?" "I'm here, boss." Billy's voice came from the rock to my left. "We're all here. We've been waiting for you." "They came looking for you," the creature said, "after they died in your mine. They followed you here. They want to know why you ran away." "I didn't run away," I said. "I tried to help. I tried to dig you out for 3 hours," Billy's voice said from the wall. "Then you gave up. Then you started drinking. Then you came down here to hide." The thing was getting closer. With each step, our small circle of light got smaller. The darkness was closing in. "I feed on guilt," the creature said, "on shame, on the weight of what people carry. You've been feeding me for 5 years, Jonathan. Every time you blame yourself, every time you drink to forget, every time you come down into caves like this to punish yourself." "That's not true," I said. "Isn't it?" The thing was only a few feet away now. "Look around you. Look at your friends." I turned my light on the others. Mike was pressed against the wall, staring at nothing. Lisa was crying without making any sound. Sarah was shaking so hard I could hear her teeth chattering. And Tommy Tommy was smiling at the creature like it was an old friend. "They're scared. Because they can feel it too," the thing said. "The hunger, the need. Soon they'll be hungry enough to do anything, even eat each other." "No," I said. "We're not animals." "Everyone's an animal when they're hungry enough," it said. "When they're trapped long enough. When they're scared long enough." The creature reached out one long arm toward Sarah. She screamed and pressed herself against the wall, but she couldn't move away. None of us could. Our feet felt like they were stuck to the ground. "Don't touch her," I said. "Why not?" it asked. "She's afraid. Fear makes the meat tender." That's when I realized what it wanted. Not just to scare us, not just to trap us. It wanted to eat us, and it wanted us to help. The creature reached for Sarah again, and something inside me snapped. "Get away from her!" I shouted, pushing between them. The thing looked at me with those black eyes. "You want to protect them like you protected your mining crew?" "That was different," I said. "That was an accident." "Was it?" The creature smiled with too many teeth. "Or were you just greedy? Just one more hour? Just a little more coal? Just enough to make the bosses happy?" I felt like I was back in that mine, hearing the wood creak, feeling the ground shake, making the choice that killed 7 good men. "I made a mistake," I whispered. "Yes," it said, "and now you'll make another." The creature stepped back, and suddenly the cave around us changed again. The walls moved apart, making the chamber bigger. Much bigger. And in the new space, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Bodies, dozens of them. Old bones and new corpses, all arranged in circles like the ones we'd seen before. But these weren't ancient. Some still had clothes on. Fresh clothes. Other cave groups, the creature said, like it was talking about the weather. They came looking for adventure. They found me instead. I saw modern hiking boots, a watch that still glowed in the dark, a water bottle with a college sticker on it. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked. "Time moves differently down here," it said. "Could be years, could be decades. Does it matter?" Sarah was crying now, real tears, not just fear. "We're going to die down here." "Not all of you," the creature said. "I only need one. The others can go free." "Which one?" Mike asked. His voice was barely a whisper. "The one who chooses to stay," it said. "The one who feeds me willingly." Tommy stepped forward. "I'll do it." "Tommy, no," Lisa said, grabbing his arm, but Tommy pulled away. "It's okay. They've been talking to me. The voices in the walls. They explained everything." "What did they tell you?" I asked. "That someone has to pay," Tommy said. "Someone always has to pay, and it should be someone who deserves it." He looked right at me when he said it. "Tommy's right," said Billy's voice from the wall. "You left us to die, boss. Now it's your turn." The other voices joined in. My whole crew calling from the rock around us. "You knew the mine was dangerous. You heard the supports breaking. You chose money over our lives. Now choose again, Jonathan. Your life or theirs." The creature was watching me, waiting. "Well, what's it going to be?" I looked at my group. Sarah still pressed against the wall, shaking. Mike and Lisa holding each other tight. Tommy staring at me with those wild eyes. They trusted me to get them out, just like my crew had trusted me to keep them safe. "If I stay," I said slowly. "You'll let them go?" "I will," the creature said. "I keep my promises. How do I know you're telling the truth?" "Because I'm hungry now," it said. "I've been feeding on your guilt for years, but it's not enough anymore. I need something real, something final." I reached into my pack and pulled out something I'd carried for 5 years. 7 mining helmets, the helmets of my dead crew. I'd brought them to leave in a deep chamber as a memorial. "I've been carrying these," I said, holding them up, "waiting for the right place to say goodbye." "Touching," the creature said. "But helmets don't satisfy hunger." I wasn't talking to the creature anymore. I was talking to the voices in the walls. "Billy, Jim, all of you, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I let you down. Sorry doesn't bring us back. Frank's voice said from the rock. No, I agreed, but maybe this will make it right. I reached into my pack again and pulled out something else. Something I'd brought from my mining days. Dynamite. 3 sticks of it, old but still good. Jonathan, what are you doing? Sarah asked. Getting you out of here, I said. The creature saw the dynamite and took a step back. That won't work. You can't kill me with explosives. Maybe not, I said. But I can bring down this whole chamber, bury you under 1,000 tons of rock. Make sure you never hurt anyone else, and bury yourself too, it pointed out. Yeah, I said. That's the point. I looked at my group one more time. There's a passage behind you. Small one, near the floor. It slopes up. Follow it and keep going.
Up?
Don't stop. Don't look back. It'll take you to the surface. We're not leaving you, Mike said. Yes, you are, I said firmly. That's an order. I lit the fuse on the dynamite. It started burning slow, giving them time to get away. Go! I shouted. Now! Sarah moved first, crawling toward the small passage I'd spotted. The others followed her. Tommy went last, still looking back at me with those strange eyes. You don't have to do this, he said. Yes, I do, I said. I should have done it. 5 years ago, the creature was backing away from me now, afraid of the burning fuse. This won't end it, it said. I'll dig my way out. I'll find other caves, other people. Maybe, I said, but not today. The voices from the walls were getting quieter now, fading away. Boss? Billy's voice, soft now, almost peaceful. Thank you. We forgive you, Jim said. It's time to rest, Frank added. One by one, the voices of my crew said goodbye. For the first time in 5 years, they sounded like they were at peace. The fuse was getting shorter. Maybe 30 seconds left. The creature made one last try to escape, heading for the passage my group had used. But I stood in its way. You're not following them, I said. Then we both die, it said. I've been dead for 5 years, I said. This is just making it official. The fuse hit the dynamite. The explosion was louder than anything I'd ever heard. Louder than the mine collapse. Louder than thunder. The sound filled the chamber and echoed through every tunnel in the cave system. Rock fell like rain. Big chunks and small pieces, filling the air with dust and noise. The creature screamed as the ceiling came down, but its scream was cut short when a boulder the size of a car landed where it had been standing. I felt rocks hit me, but there was no pain. Just a strange kind of peace, like I was finally where I belonged. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the sound of my group's voices, far away and getting farther, calling back to me from the passage that led to safety. They made it out. That's all that mattered. The explosion echoed through Mammoth Cave for 3 full minutes. Sarah crawled through the narrow passage first, her hands bleeding from sharp rocks. Behind her came Mike, then Lisa, then Tommy. They climbed up through the darkness, following the slope that led toward the surface. They didn't talk. They couldn't. The sound of the explosion was still ringing in their ears. The sound of Jonathan, choosing to die so they could live. It took them 2 hours to reach daylight. When they finally stumbled out of a cave opening they'd never seen before, the sun was setting. They were 5 miles from where they'd entered that morning. Park rangers found them sitting by the cave entrance, covered in dust and blood, staring at nothing. Where's your guide? Ranger Peterson asked. Where's Jonathan? Sarah tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How do you tell someone that caves can change shape? That dead people can talk through walls, that monsters are real? There was an accident, she finally said. Jonathan, he didn't make it out. The rescue team went down into the caves that night. They found the passage Sarah described, but it was blocked, completely sealed with tons of fallen rock. It would take weeks to dig through, and by then it would be too late to save anyone trapped on the other side. They never found Jonathan's body. They never found the creature either, though. They wouldn't have known what to look for. The Park Service closed that section of Mammoth Cave permanently. Too dangerous, they said. Too unstable after the rockfall, but that wasn't the end of the story. Sarah went back to teaching geology at the university, but she changed her focus. No more caves, no more underground research. She stuck to surface rocks, mountains, things that were safely in the sunlight. Mike and Lisa stopped caving altogether. They sold all their equipment and moved to Arizona, where the ground was dry and solid, and you could see for miles in every direction. Tommy was different. The voices that had spoken to him in the cave didn't stop when he reached the surface. He could still hear them sometimes, whispering in quiet places. He started drinking, just like Jonathan had. By winter, he was in a hospital, talking to doctors about voices in the walls. The four of them never spoke to each other again. They tried to forget what happened down there. They tried to convince themselves it had been hallucinations, caused by bad air or stress or fear, but they all had the same dreams. Dreams about Jonathan, still down there in the dark, still protecting them from something that wasn't quite dead. 6 months after the cave-in, strange things started happening at Mammoth Cave. Tour guides reported hearing sounds from the sealed section. Tapping sounds, like someone trying to dig their way out. Scraping sounds, like claws on stone. Some visitors claimed they heard voices calling for help from behind the blocked passages. Always late in the day, when the tours were ending and the caves were getting quiet, the Park Service investigated, but they never found anything. Just solid rock where the passages used to be. But at night, when the caves were closed to tourists, the rangers on duty reported other things. Cold spots in places that had always been warm. Compass needles spinning for no reason. Flashlight beams that bent in impossible directions, and sometimes, just sometimes, they found fresh scratches on the walls near the sealed section. Deep gouges in the limestone, like something with very long claws was trying to dig its way out. Ranger Peterson, who'd been working at Mammoth Cave for 20 years, put in for a transfer after the 3rd time he found those scratches. Something's still down there, he told his supervisor, something that shouldn't be. But the Park Service couldn't close Mammoth Cave completely. Too many tourists, too much money. They just added more security, more warnings about staying with tour groups, more rules about not wandering off into unmarked passages. The scratches kept appearing. Then, 2 years after Jonathan's sacrifice, a maintenance worker named Dave Collins was checking water pipes in a section near the sealed area. He was alone, working late, when he heard something that made him stop, tapping. 3 quick taps, then silence, then 3 more taps. It was coming from behind the wall. Dave put his ear to the rock and listened. The tapping came again, closer this time. Then he heard something else, a voice, faint but clear. "Help me." Dave stepped back from the wall. "Who's there?" "It's Jonathan," the voice said. "I'm trapped. I need help." Dave knew the story. Everyone who worked at the cave knew about the guide who died in the explosion 2 years ago. "Jonathan Blackthorne?" Dave asked. "Yes, please. I've been trying to dig out for so long. I'm hurt. I need help." Dave's hand moved toward his radio, ready to call for a rescue team. But then he stopped. Jonathan's voice was coming from solid rock. Rock that had been sealed for 2 years. "Please," the voice said again. But this time it sounded different, hungrier. "I'm so hungry down here. So hungry." Dave ran. He quit his job the next day and moved to Florida, where the ground was sandy and soft, and nothing lived in deep, dark places. But before he left, he told his supervisor about the voice. His supervisor checked the sealed section personally. He found fresh scratches on the walls, deep ones, and when he put his ear to the rock, he heard something too. Not Jonathan's voice, something else, something that laughed when it heard him listening. The Park Service added more concrete to the sealed passages. Steel bars, warning signs, but late at night, when the caves were empty and quiet, people still heard sounds from behind the barriers. Digging sounds, hungry sounds, and sometimes, just sometimes, they heard Jonathan's voice warning people to stay. "Away! "Don't come down here," he would whisper through the rock. "I'm holding it back, but I can't hold it forever." The creature was still alive down there, still hungry, still digging, and Jonathan was still fighting it even in death. But concrete cracks, steel rusts, and hunger, real hunger, never dies. It just waits and waits and waits.